Most players sprint through Central Yharnam thinking it is just a tutorial zone, but buried beneath its cobblestones, its crow-infested rooftops, and its locked doors is a web of secrets so dense and deliberate that even veterans who have sunk hundreds of hours into this game have never seen all of it. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. I put this video together because Central Yharnam kept pulling me back. Every time I thought I had seen everything, I found another note, another item placement, another enemy behaviour that suggested something deeper was going on. This video focuses specifically on the environmental storytelling and hidden lore of this one area, because I think it gets dismissed too quickly. When assembling this, I made a deliberate choice to exclude the later game revelations that recontextualize Yharnam as a whole, and instead focus only on what Central Yharnam itself is telling you, in isolation, as if you are reading it fresh. Some things I reordered so that the mysteries build on each other rather than jumping around randomly. What you are about to hear is my interpretation of the evidence. Where the lore is ambiguous, I will say so. Where it points strongly in one direction, I will say that too. Let us get into it. Chapter 1. The City Before the Hunt. Central Yharnam was not always a place of fire and screaming. There is evidence woven into the architecture itself that suggests this district was once a functioning, even prosperous, part of the city. The buildings are tall and ornate in the way that old European cities tend to be, with wrought iron railings, carved stonework, and windows that would have let in generous amounts of light before the boards went up. The design philosophy of the area is not that of a slum. It is a middle-class district that has been catastrophically destroyed. The very first thing you notice when you drop into Central Yharnam from the sewer grate is that the streets are not simply abandoned. They are barricaded. There is a difference. Abandoned streets have an emptiness to them. These streets have been actively sealed off, with wagons pushed across alleyways and wooden planks nailed over doorways, in ways that suggest people were either trying to keep something out or trying to keep something in. Given what we know about the night of the hunt, the answer is probably both. The braziers burning throughout the area are a detail that almost everyone notices, but few people stop to think about. Someone lit those fires. The hunt is described as something that happens on a single night, and yet those fires are clearly maintained and burning. This suggests one of two things. Either the hunt has been going on far longer than anyone admits, or there are people, maybe hunters, maybe survivors, who have been tending to these fires to keep the beasts at bay. Neither explanation is entirely comforting. Look at the lampposts that line the main boulevard. They are not all lit. Some are dark, and the ones that are dark tend to cluster around areas of higher beast activity. This is probably coincidence, but it is the kind of detail that makes you wonder whether the beasts actively avoid light, or whether the areas with more beast activity simply had their lampposts destroyed during early conflicts that happened before you arrived. The crows perched on the rooftops are another detail that rewards attention. Crows are carrion birds. They gather where there is death, and the density of crow populations in Central Yharnam suggests that there has been an enormous amount of death in this area over what appears to be an extended period. You do not get that many crows from a single night of hunting. That kind of scavenger population builds up over weeks or months. The architecture of the area includes several buildings that have clearly been retrofitted for a purpose they were not originally designed to serve. The large building near the first shortcut ladder, for example, has what appear to be holding cells on its lower floors that were added after the original construction. The iron bars are newer than the stonework around them, and the bolt holes where they were anchored are clean and precise, in a way that contrasts with the weathered stone they pierce. There are also what appear to be medical waste disposal chutes built into the sides of several buildings. These are vertical shafts that open into the street or into the canal below, and they are sized in a way that suggests they were used to dispose of bodies or large quantities of biological material. This is not standard architecture for a residential district. These were added for a reason. The canal system running beneath Central Yharnam deserves far more attention than it usually gets. The canals themselves are ancient, far older than the buildings above them, and the stonework shows a different stylistic language than the Victorian-influenced architecture overhead. The people who built the canals and the people who built the city above them were not the same people, or at the very least, they were not operating in the same cultural tradition. The water in the canals is not simply dirty. It has a specific colour and consistency that suggests it has been contaminated with blood. And not recently. The staining on the canal walls goes deep, indicating this contamination has been ongoing for a very long time. Whatever was being disposed of through those chutes, it was happening regularly and in large enough quantities to permanently alter the colour of the water. The giant chained-up creatures at the bottom of the canal are one of the most talked about elements of Central Yharnam. But what people miss is that the chains themselves are architectural. They are not improvised restraints. They are built into the canal walls with anchor points that were clearly planned and constructed intentionally. Someone built this canal system with the specific intention of eventually chaining something to the bottom of it. The brick trolls, or brick giants as some players call them, that patrol certain areas of Central Yharnam are not beasts in the traditional sense. They have not transformed. They are enormous, lumbering, clearly not fully human anymore, but they retain enough cognitive function to use improvised tools, to react to sound, and to patrol routes. This suggests they are in a transitional state that is neither fully beast nor fully human, and the fact that they are present in an area as central as this one suggests this transformation is not new. The torches that some of the brick trolls carry are a particularly interesting detail. Fire is a tool. It requires intentional use. The fact that these creatures are carrying and apparently maintaining torches suggests a level of retained instinct or intelligence that goes beyond simple bestial aggression. They are not mindlessly destroying the city. They are, in some distorted way, continuing to occupy and perhaps even maintain it. The layout of Central Yharnam suggests a city district that had multiple distinct functional zones. There is an area that appears to have been a marketplace, identifiable by the wider streets and the remnants of what might have been stalls or kiosks. There is a residential zone with narrower streets and buildings of a more domestic scale. And there is what appears to have been a civic or administrative zone near the large gate that connects to the cathedral district. That large gate is one of the more underappreciated mysteries of Central Yharnam. It is enormous, far larger than would be necessary for simple pedestrian traffic, and it is decorated with ecclesiastical motifs that suggest it was not merely a practical barrier, but a symbolic one. The gate marks a transition from civic Yharnam to sacred Yharnam, and the fact that it is locked from the other side suggests that whoever locked it did not want people moving from the cathedral district back into Central Yharnam. The note left near the gate area, which warns players not to trust the healing church, is one of the most debated pieces of environmental storytelling in the game. The note is written in blood, which in the context of Bloodborne suggests it was written during the hunt, and the specificity of its warning implies that whoever wrote it had personal experience with church betrayal, rather than simply repeating rumours. The rooftop areas of Central Yharnam are a labyrinth that most players explore only partially. The upper levels of the district tell a different story than the street level, because the rooftops were clearly used as an escape route by residents who were trying to get away from whatever was happening below. You can trace paths across the rooftops that have been deliberately cleared, with boxes and barrels moved aside and planks laid across gaps. These improvised rooftop pathways suggest that at some point during the early stages of the outbreak, there were survivors moving through this area who were organised enough to plan an escape route. The fact that the pathways are there but no survivors remain, is itself a story. Something went wrong with the escape. Either the beasts reached the rooftops, or the survivors found nowhere safe to go. The caged areas near the upper sections of Central Yharnam contain enemies that have clearly been deliberately imprisoned. The cages themselves are not damaged from the outbreak. They are purpose-built containment structures with functioning locks. Some of these cages contain beasts, some contain humans who are mid-transformation. The intentionality of this imprisonment raises uncomfortable questions about who was imprisoning whom and for what purpose. There is a building in Central Yharnam with a large number of windows that have been broken from the inside, not from the outside. The shatter patterns on the glass remnants and the direction of the debris on the street below both indicate that whatever broke those windows was inside the building and was trying to get out. The size and pattern of the breaks suggests something larger than a normal human, was responsible. The positioning of the Molotov cocktail items scattered throughout Central Yharnam is not random. They cluster in areas that would serve as natural choke points near narrow alleyways, at the tops of stairs, in the approaches to major street intersections. This suggests they were placed by someone who was either planning a defensive position or had already been using them defensively, and these are simply the ones that were not thrown. The Hunter-Messenger NPC near the beginning of the level is dead when you find her, but the messages she leaves behind and the context of her position suggest she survived long enough to observe a significant amount of what happened in this area. Her placement near the River of Blood and her apparent cause of death raise questions about whether she was killed by beasts, by other hunters, or by something else entirely. The street level of Central Yharnam is consistently lower than the surrounding architecture, which is not typical of European-style city planning. Streets were usually kept at grade with the surrounding terrain or elevated slightly for drainage purposes. The sunken quality of Central Yharnam's streets suggests either deliberate construction or gradual subsidence, and either explanation opens up interesting possibilities about what lies beneath. The sewers that run beneath the streets and connect to the canal system are navigable, and the things you find in them are not consistent with what you would expect from a simple waste disposal system. The creatures living in the sewers, the items dropped by them, and the environmental details of the sewer tunnels all suggest that the underground network of Central Yharnam serves or has served multiple functions, not all of them sanitary. The presence of blood in the sewers is expected. The presence of specific medical paraphernalia in the sewers is not. Syringes, vials, fragments of what appear to be experimental apparatus, and in some cases the remains of what seem to be failed medical procedures, have all been noted by players who explore the sewer areas thoroughly. Someone was using these tunnels for purposes beyond simple waste disposal. The locked doors of Central Yharnam are numerous and varied, and the locks themselves tell different stories. Some are simple residential locks, others are institutional locks of the kind used on secure facilities, and a few are something else entirely, with locking mechanisms that are more complex than anything that should be necessary for a residential district. The windows of Central Yharnam are another underexplored detail. Most are boarded up, but not all of them. Some are simply dark and empty. And a few have things hanging in them. Cloth, implements, objects whose function is not immediately clear. The items hanging in windows in Bloodborne tend to be signals, remnants of a language of symbols that the residents of Yharnam used to communicate information across the city during the outbreak. The sound design of Central Yharnam is doing enormous amounts of narrative work that most players process subconsciously rather than analytically. The ambient audio changes depending on where you are and what time of night the game implies it is, and the sounds of distant screaming, breaking glass, and what might be prayers or chanting shift in ways that suggest ongoing events happening just beyond the edge of the screen. The fire that destroys the brick troll at the beginning of the game is triggered by the player throwing fire at the oil drum. but the oil drum itself suggests preparation. It was placed there with the intent of creating a fire hazard, and the positioning of the troll's patrol route in relation to the drum suggests someone placed the drum with the specific intention of luring the troll into it, someone who knew that trolls patrol route. The dogs of Central Yharnam, unlike the beasts, have not transformed. They are simply dogs, albeit extremely aggressive ones, but their behaviour suggests they have been trained rather than simply feral, and the type of training they exhibit, pack hunting, coordinated attack patterns, targeting specific body parts, is consistent with trained guard animals rather than wild ones. These were someone's dogs once. The burning effigies that appear in certain areas of Central Yharnam are a detail that most players see, but few examine closely. They are not simply burning piles of debris. They are constructed arrangements that suggest intentional creation, and the materials used in their construction include both organic matter and specific items that appear to have been chosen deliberately. The graffiti and markings on the walls of Central Yharnam are not all created equal. Some are simple warnings left during the outbreak, others appear to be older, faded into the stone in a way that suggests they predate the hunt by years or decades, and some appear to be in a writing system that does not match the standard script used elsewhere in Yharnam, suggesting either a different cultural group or a deliberately coded language. The positioning of item pickups throughout Central Yharnam follows a logic that rewards attention. Items that would logically belong to a particular type of person tend to be found in areas consistent with that person having been there. Medical items near what appear to have been treatment areas. Weapons near what appear to have been defensive positions. Consumables near shelter areas. The world is telling you where people were and what they were doing. The fog that rolls through certain areas of Central Yharnam at specific times is not simply atmospheric. It corresponds to areas of particularly high beast concentration and has a quality that differs from normal fog in ways that suggest it may be related to the same phenomena that create the nightmare spaces found elsewhere in the game. Central Yharnam may have thinner walls between reality and the nightmare than most players realise. The height of the buildings in Central Yharnam increases as you move further into the district, which creates a gradually increasing sense of claustrophobia as the streets narrow and the buildings loom higher. This is partly deliberate level design, but it also reflects something true about the district's history. The taller buildings near the district's centre are older, built when land was scarcer and construction techniques more ambitious. The iron fencing throughout Central Yharnam is decorative in origin, but has clearly been repurposed as barrier material during the outbreak. Sections have been cut, bent, and repositioned in ways that suggest improvised crowd or beast control. The cuts are not clean, and the repositioning is not precise, indicating this was done under pressure rather than with careful planning. The lamp oil used in the various light sources throughout Central Yharnam comes from somewhere, and the infrastructure for supplying it is not immediately obvious. There are no obvious oil storage facilities visible in the area, which suggests either that the supplies were exhausted long ago and the remaining lights are simply burning through their last reserves, or that the supply infrastructure is hidden in the underground sections of the district. The water troughs and fountains of Central Yharnam are dry. This seems like a minor detail, but urban water systems are infrastructure, and their failure points to a specific sequence of events. The water system failed before the fires were set, because if the fires had come first, someone would have used the water system to fight them. The water system was either deliberately disabled or failed due to the withdrawal of the people who maintained it. The cobblestones of Central Yharnam streets show specific damage patterns that tell a story about the progression of violence through the district. Near the outskirts, the damage is minimal. Near the centre, the cobblestones are cracked, displaced, and in some areas, completely destroyed. The progression of damage correlates roughly with distance from the cathedral gate, suggesting that the violence radiated outward from the cathedral area rather than inward from the city perimeter. The size of the beast population in Central Yharnam relative to the apparent human population that once lived there suggests a very high conversion rate. Almost everyone who lived here became a beast, which is statistically unusual even given the events described in the game's lore. Something about Central Yharnam specifically created conditions that accelerated the transformation, either a higher concentration of contaminated blood ministrations, proximity to specific healing church operations, or something environmental about the district itself. The placement of the gaol or prison area connected to Central Yharnam is interesting because it suggests that even before the outbreak became unmanageable, authorities were imprisoning people rather than treating them. The cells show signs of extended occupation, meaning people were kept there for days or longer, not simply processed and released. What they were being held for, and what eventually happened to them, is not stated, but can be inferred from the state of the cells. The specific position of Central Yharnam in relation to the rest of the city is worth thinking about. It is sandwiched between the lower-class districts and the ecclesiastical heights, which makes it the literal and symbolic middle ground of Yharnam. It is the place where the two halves of the city's social structure met, where the church's influence filtered down into ordinary life, and where ordinary life's problems accumulated within sight of the cathedral. The skyline of Central Yharnam, visible from certain elevated positions, includes structures that do not obviously serve a residential or civic purpose. There are towers of uncertain function, chimneys attached to buildings whose interiors do not appear to contain furnaces, and at least one structure that appears to be an observation post of some kind. The city was being watched from within before the hunt began. The benches and seating areas scattered through Central Yharnam are a quietly devastating detail. They suggest a city where people sat outside, talked to neighbours, watched the street. The intimacy of those spaces, now occupied by beasts or burning, communicates the human cost of what happened here in a way that no amount of explicit narrative could match. The weight of Central Yharnam as an environment comes from this accumulation of specific, grounded details that together suggest a community that was real, that had rhythms and relationships and infrastructure, and that was destroyed not by an external force, but by something it had welcomed into, its own veins. The tragedy of this district is not abstract. It is written in every locked door and every dry fountain and every cage that someone built with their own hands. The specific items dropped by the enemies in Central Yharnam, when examined carefully, form a kind of inventory of what the residents of this district carried with them during the night of transformation. Blood vials, pungent blood cocktails, quicksilver bullets. These are hunters' supplies, which means either that the residents had access to hunter equipment, or that many of the transformed enemies were themselves hunters. The latter possibility is one that the game raises, but does not resolve cleanly. If many of the enemies in Central Yharnam were originally hunters, then the district was at some point a staging area for hunter activity, which would explain both the concentration of hunter supplies and the unusual violence of the beast population. Hunters turned beast are described elsewhere in the lore as being particularly dangerous precisely because they retain some of their combat instincts. The end of Central Yharnam as a navigable zone comes at the cleric-beast encounter, and the positioning of this first boss fight is deliberately symbolic. The cleric-beast is a cleric who has transformed, a member of the healing church who has become exactly what the healing church is supposed to prevent. That this confrontation happens at the end of Central Yharnam, the district that exists in the shadow of the church, is not an accident, it is an argument. Chapter 2. The Beasts of the Boulevard. The enemy distribution in Central Yharnam is not random. If you map out where each enemy type is positioned and what they are doing when you first encounter them, a pattern emerges that tells a coherent story about how the transformation spread through the district and what each affected person was doing when it overtook them. The first enemies you encounter after the initial descent into Central Yharnam are standing, not prowling. They are in positions that suggest they were doing something specific when the transformation hit, standing near a doorway, crouching near a fire, gathered in small groups. The transformation preserved their spatial relationships to each other and to the environment, even as it destroyed their humanity. This is an important detail because it tells you something about the speed of the transformation in this area. A slow transformation would produce enemies scattered randomly through the district as they wandered during the process. A fast transformation would produce enemies frozen in whatever position and activity they occupied at the moment of change. Central Yharnam's enemies look like the second type. The group of enemies gathered near the first major fire in the district are facing the fire, which suggests they were watching it when they transformed. Who lit the fire? Why were multiple people gathered around it? The most logical explanation is that the fire was already burning, perhaps lit as a beacon or a defense, and the people gathered around it were seeking its warmth or its protection at the moment the transformation swept through. The lone enemy near the first shortcut ladder is positioned on a rooftop at a point that offers a view of two separate street sections below. This enemy was a lookout, someone stationed there to watch for approaching threats, and whoever stationed them there had enough organizational presence to assign specific roles to specific people, which implies a level of pre-crisis planning that contradicts the narrative of Central Yharnam has simply overrun without warning. The pair of enemies near the first window ambush are positioned behind the window in a way that suggests they chose that position deliberately. They are in ambush positions, which means at some point they were thinking clearly enough to choose an ambush over direct confrontation, and the persistence of that positional choice after transformation suggests these enemies retain some form of tactical instinct. The enemy that drops from the ceiling in one of the early interior sections is behaving in a way that suggests it learned this behavior during the hunt rather than arriving transformed in that position. Ceiling lurking is a hunting adaptation, not a random outcome of transformation. Whatever this creature was before, after transformation, it adopted a predatory behavior pattern that it continues to use, which suggests the beast mind is not simply chaotic, but is actively problem-solving in service of hunting goals. The enemies that appear to be trying to break into specific buildings are another example of goal-directed behavior that goes beyond simple aggression. They are not attacking randomly. They are targeting specific structures, presumably because they can sense something inside those structures that they want, whether that is surviving humans, specific scents, or something else entirely. The burning brick troll encounter is the most spectacular early moment in Central Yharnam, but the less spectacular enemy near the base of the staircase leading to that encounter is doing something that deserves attention. It is dragging something toward one of the buildings. The object being dragged is not clearly identifiable, but the behavior suggests purposeful activity rather than mindless aggression. The beasts of Central Yharnam are doing things. The group of enemies that surrounds the fire in the lower courtyard area includes what appears to be a hierarchical arrangement. One larger enemy is positioned at the center, while smaller enemies orbit it at a consistent distance. This social arrangement suggests either that beast transformation preserves some form of social hierarchy from human life, or that beasts form their own hierarchies after transformation based on size and aggression. The enemy that throws blood vials at the player is using a consumable item in a way that requires understanding cause and effect. It picks up the vial, it throws it, it expects a result. This is tool use. Whatever drove the transformation in Central Yharnam has not simply turned these people into animals. It has turned them into something that retains enough cognition for tool use while losing whatever made them recognizable as human. The patrol routes of enemies in Central Yharnam are notably consistent. Enemies walk the same routes repeatedly, without deviation and less disturbed, which is more structured than pure animal behavior and less flexible than human behavior. The routes themselves follow logical paths through the district, suggesting they may be remnants of habitual routes from before the transformation, the paths these people walked regularly in their daily lives. The enemies that congregate near specific buildings without attempting to enter them display an avoidance behaviour that is as interesting as approach behaviour. They approach, they stop, they do not cross a threshold. Something about certain buildings is keeping them out. The obvious explanation is that the buildings contain something that repels beasts, perhaps specific scents, perhaps specific materials, perhaps something more esoteric related to the game's supernatural elements. The faster, more aggressive beasts in Central Yharnam, the ones that sprint and leap rather than lumber, have a different damage type distribution on their bodies. They show injuries primarily on their hands and forearms, which is consistent with fight injuries, rather than the random damage you might expect from someone simply wandering through a disaster zone. These creatures have been fighting each other, or fighting humans, and they have been doing it for a while. The wolves in Central Yharnam are actual animals, not transformed humans, and their presence in an urban environment requires explanation. Wolves do not naturally inhabit cities. Their presence suggests either that they were kept in captivity somewhere in the district before the hunt and escaped, or that they followed prey into the urban environment from outside the city walls, or that something about the changed conditions of Central Yharnam during the hunt created an environment hospitable to predatory animals that would not normally enter a city. The behaviour of the wolves differs from the behaviour of the transformed beasts in ways that highlight how much the beasts have changed. The wolves are simply aggressive animals following instinct. The beasts are aggressive in ways that suggest purpose. The contrast makes the beasts seem more dangerous, not less, because purposeful aggression is harder to predict and counter than instinctive aggression. The crow-like creatures that attack players in certain elevated areas of Central Yharnam are not standard crows despite their resemblance. Their size, their attack patterns, and the items they sometimes carry suggest they are something more. Their presence in Central Yharnam specifically, rather than elsewhere in the game, ties them to whatever particular qualities this district has that distinguish it from other parts of Yharnam. The huntsmen, the most common enemy type in Central Yharnam, come in several distinct variants that are often treated as simply difficulty scaling, but which can also be read as representing different stages of transformation or different original social roles. The ones with clubs are workers. The ones with torches suggest either a firefighting or a fire-carrying role. The ones with guns suggest guards or ex-soldiers. The diversity of their equipment reflects the diversity of the population that once lived here. The huntsman variant that appears to pray or perform some kind of ritual gesture when undisturbed is one of the more haunting enemy behaviours in the game. It suggests that whatever passes for a mind in these creatures still has access to patterns of devotional behaviour from their human lives. They are not praying in any meaningful sense, but they are performing the physical gestures of prayer, which tells you something about how deeply ritual behaviour was embedded in the lives of Yharnam citizens before the transformation. The large huntsman that wields a second broken weapon as an offhand strike tool is improvising. The broken weapon is not designed to function as an offhand implement. This creature picked it up and found a use for it. That level of improvisation and problem-solving is alarming because it suggests the beasts are not simply working from instinct, but are capable of in-the-moment adaptation. The enemies near the cleric beast fog wall behave differently from enemies elsewhere in Central Yharnam. They are more agitated, more active, louder. Their behaviour suggests they are either afraid of or excited by what lies beyond the fog wall, and that reaction colours the entire approach to the first boss fight. These creatures, who are themselves terrifying, are responding to something that frightens or stimulates even them. The blood pool enemy behaviour, wherein specific enemies seem drawn to areas where blood has accumulated, ties into the game's broader thematic interest in blood as both substance and symbol. In Central Yharnam, blood is everywhere, running in the gutters, pooling in the canal, staining the cobblestones, and the enemies seem oriented to it in a way that goes beyond simple gore. They are attracted to blood, the way addicts are attracted to substances. The enemy positioning near ladders and vertical transitions in Central Yharnam is notably unfavourable to the player. Enemies are almost always positioned to catch players at their most vulnerable moment of transition. This could be simply good level design, but within the fiction of the game world, it suggests these creatures have learned or remembered which transitions are vulnerable points and have positioned themselves accordingly. The brick troll that guards the shortcut to the cleric beast is alone, which is unusual given that brick trolls typically appear in areas where they have a spatial advantage. This particular troll is in a position where it has no special advantage over a prepared player, suggesting it arrived at its current location through wandering rather than being placed there by any kind of organising intelligence. It is an outlier in the otherwise patterned enemy distribution of the district. The enemies inside the buildings of Central Yharnam behave differently from the enemies outside. Inside enemies tend to be more clustered and more agitated, while outside enemies tend to patrol more calmly. This behavioural difference suggests that being inside a building during the transformation created different psychological conditions than being outside, and those conditions persisted into the enemy's beast state. The twin huntsmen that guard the door to one of Central Yharnam's key shortcuts are positioned in a way that makes it almost impossible to engage one without alerting the other. This positioning is tactically sophisticated enough that it could be either a design choice or a lore choice, and probably it is both. In fiction, these two were guarding that door together before the transformation, and continued to guard it together afterward, because whatever cognitive patterns drove their pre-transformation behaviour persisted into their beast state. The enemies that appear to be guarding specific items are performing a protective function that has survived their transformation. Whatever they were protecting before, they continue to protect after. The items they guard are not always obviously valuable, which suggests the logic of their protection is based on pre-transformation values rather than beast values, and those pre-transformation values we can only guess at from the item's contents and locations. The huntsman with the rifle occupying certain rooftop positions in Central Yharnam presents a particular lore puzzle. Rifle use requires significant training and cognitive function. The fact that these enemies retain enough function to use rifles, aim them accurately, and reload them suggests either that firearm use is deeply enough embedded in their muscle memory to survive transformation, or that the transformation in Yharnam preserves more cognitive function than the visual horror of the beast forms implies. The sound beasts make in Central Yharnam includes what appears to be attempts at speech. Not successful speech, not recognisable words, but the cadence and rhythm of what they produce when not actively attacking sounds more like frustrated or pained vocalizations than animal sounds. It sounds like someone who has forgotten language, but not the impulse to use it. The specific damage types that are most effective against Central Yharnam enemies, fire being notable among them, ties into the district's history with the healing church. The church's enemies, the beasts they claim to be trying to control, are most effectively killed with fire. The church also makes heavy use of fire in its rituals and architecture. The same substance that the church uses to sanctify and to destroy is the same substance that kills the thing the church created. That is a tight circle. The enemies in the flooded underground sections beneath Central Yharnam are fundamentally different from the enemies above ground. They are more adapted to their environment, suggesting they have been down there longer. Their behaviour implies that the underground sections of Central Yharnam were affected by the transformation significantly earlier than the street level, which raises questions about what the underground sections were being used for in the period before the hunt began. The way enemies in Central Yharnam respond to the player's lamp is interesting. The lamp is a key mechanic of navigation, but also a light source, and some enemies appear to react to its light while others do not. The ones that react to light and move toward it are behaving in a way that suggests they are drawn to it, possibly because they associate light with safety or warmth from their human lives, and retain that association in distorted form. The executioner enemy type, found in certain sections of Central Yharnam, is wearing an execution hood and carrying an execution implement. This was someone's job before the hunt. Not a healing church job in the religious sense, but a civic enforcement role, the person tasked with carrying out punishments. The fact that this role existed, and was clearly active in Central Yharnam, tells you something about the social conditions of the district before the outbreak. The enemy that appears to be eating something when first encountered in one of the early courtyard areas is doing so in a specific location, rather than randomly. The location is near what appears to have been a food stall or market area. The creature is still going to places associated with food, even though its relationship with food has clearly changed drastically. Habit, or something that functions like habit, has survived the transformation. The enemies that carry lanterns in Central Yharnam are carrying light sources. In the context of the hunt's darkness, a light source is both practical and symbolic. These creatures are wandering through the darkness, carrying lights, which creates a visual image that is genuinely unsettling, because it implies they are looking for something. Not hunting in the instinctive sense, looking in the more deliberate sense. What they are looking for is one of Central Yharnam's quieter mysteries. The beast at the top of the very tall ladder, positioned to ambush players making the long climb, is one of the crueler enemy placements in the game. But within the fiction, what is interesting is that this creature climbed that ladder to get to its current position. It is not simply placed there, it got there on its own, which means it is capable of vertical navigation and chose that position for the same reason a player might recognize it as dangerous. It is a good ambush position, and the beast knows it. The enemies that appear to be fighting each other in certain areas of Central Yharnam are doing so along what appear to be territorial lines rather than randomly. The territory divisions correspond roughly to the pre-transformation neighbourhood divisions of the district, suggesting that social and spatial allegiances from human life have persisted into beast life in the form of territorial aggression. The very small number of enemies that drop unique or unusual items in Central Yharnam are not distributed randomly. The rare drops cluster around specific locations that appear to have had special significance before the transformation, near the locked doors, near what appear to have been significant communal spaces, near structures of uncertain function. The enemies that carry unusual items were near unusual things when the transformation hit. The group of enemies in the courtyard beneath the large suspended cage are positioned beneath the cage deliberately. They are not simply wandering. They chose to be under that cage, or they were drawn there by something about the cage. What is in the cage, or what was in the cage, and why it draws these specific enemies, is one of the questions that Central Yharnam's enemy distribution raises and does not clearly answer. The enemy that is on fire, but still attacking, is one of those details that shifts from spectacular to tragic once you start thinking about it in lore terms. This was a person. That person is now on fire. And whatever is driving them to continue moving and attacking through the experience of being on fire is so powerful that it overrides a survival instinct that is among the most fundamental biological drives an organism can have. Whatever Central Yharnam's beasts are driven by, it is stronger than the fear of death. The enemies clustered near the River of Blood at the lower sections of Central Yharnam have gathered at the edge, but do not enter the blood river itself. The same creatures that are soaked in blood, that appear to be attracted to blood, that are arguably composed of nothing but transformed blood, draw back from the concentrated river of it. That avoidance behaviour is one of the most pointed mysteries in the district's enemy ecology, and what it implies about the nature of the blood in that specific location deserves serious consideration. Chapter 3. The Locked Doors of Central Yharnam. There are more locked doors in Central Yharnam than in any other area of Bloodborne, and this is not an accident. The density of locked doors in this district reflects something true about what Yharnam was before the hunt and what it became during it. Doors are locked by people who are afraid, and the number of locked doors in Central Yharnam tells you how afraid its residents were, and how many of them survived long enough to lock a door. The first locked door you encounter is near the very beginning of the district, shortly after descending into the main street. It is a simple residential door, and it is locked from the inside. The lock mechanism on this type of door requires someone on the interior side to engage it, which means someone was inside this building and chose to lock themselves in. Whether they survived and what happened to them if they did is not stated. The second category of locked doors in Central Yharnam are the ones that are locked from the outside with heavy bolt mechanisms or chains. These are not locks that a frightened resident pulled shut from the inside. These are locks applied by someone who wanted to ensure whatever was inside could not get out. The distinction between imprisoning something and sheltering from something is profound, and Central Yharnam has both types of locked doors in roughly equal numbers. The locked door near the shortcut ladder that players discover early in their exploration of the district opens from a key found in a later section of the same area, and the route required to retrieve that key is non-trivial. This is clearly deliberate game design, but within the fiction of the world, it suggests that whoever locked this door and whoever held the key were not in the same location, which implies a separation event. The key holder and the door locker were separated, and only one of them was able to go back. The large double doors in the lower section of Central Yharnam that appear to connect to the sewers below are sealed with what looks like recent improvised barricades rather than standard locks. Someone piled debris against these doors from the outside after the locks failed, or after the locks were insufficient. This is emergency construction done under pressure, and the materials used, furniture, construction waste, pieces of other structures, tell you something about how desperate the situation was when this barricade was built. The door near the lamppost that seems like it should be a shortcut but goes nowhere accessible is one of those architectural details that suggests the level was not designed to be a perfect map of a real space, but rather a selective recreation that emphasizes specific elements. However, within the fiction, a door that appears to go nowhere may simply connect to a section of the building whose interior is not accessible from the player's route, and those inaccessible interiors are where some of Central Yharnam's most interesting speculation lives. The gate leading to the upper part of the district, which requires a specific mechanism to open, is positioned in a way that suggests it was originally intended as crowd control rather than security. It is wide enough to allow significant foot traffic when open, and the control mechanism is positioned for efficient operation by a single person. This was a gate operated by a gatekeeper, someone whose job was to regulate movement between sections of the district. The existence of a gate controlled by a gatekeeper implies a reason for controlling movement. Central Yharnam had sections that not everyone was allowed to access, and the access control was official enough to require a dedicated employee. What was in the restricted section and who was being restricted from accessing it is a question the environment raises without clearly answering. The windows in Central Yharnam that are boarded up from the outside rather than from the inside present the same interpretive challenge as the externally locked doors. Someone outside the building chose to seal the windows from without, which means either they were protecting something inside the building from the outside world, or they were sealing something inside the building away from the outside world. The difference between protection and imprisonment in Central Yharnam is often unclear. The locked iron grate in the lower sections of Central Yharnam that leads to the canal system below is a particularly interesting case, because iron grates over canal access points are standard urban infrastructure, not unusual imprisonment or security measures. But the additional locks applied to this specific grate beyond its standard mechanism suggest that something about this particular access point warranted extra security. What came up through this grate, or what was feared to come up through it, required more than the standard barrier. The door Near the Cleric Beast fog wall is the most symbolically loaded locked door in Central Yharnam. It is not a residential door or a security door. It is a door to somewhere important, and it remains locked throughout the entire area, drawing attention without ever opening. Its position near the first boss encounter suggests it connects to something that will be relevant to the larger story, but within Central Yharnam itself, it simply stands there, locked, pointing to something the player cannot yet reach. The pattern of which doors are locked from inside versus outside in Central Yharnam, when mapped carefully, suggests two simultaneous containment operations happening in the same district. From the inside, residents were locking themselves into their homes, trying to survive. From the outside, some other entity, something organised enough to apply exterior locks and construct exterior barricades, was trying to contain the spread of the transformation. Both operations appear to have failed. The exterior locking operation is particularly interesting, because it requires the existence of an organised party capable of operating in Central Yharnam during the hunt, identifying buildings that needed to be contained, applying exterior locks and barriers, and then moving on. That is not the behaviour of panicking survivors. That is the behaviour of trained personnel operating according to a plan. The Healing Church, the Hunters, or some third party were operating in Central Yharnam with a containment strategy, and that strategy did not work. The building in the upper section of Central Yharnam that has every window and door sealed, except for a single upper floor window that remains open, is telling a specific story. Someone sealed this building from the outside, methodically, window by window and door by door, except for one window on an upper floor that they either could not reach, chose not to seal, or that was unsealed from the inside. That open window is either an escape route that someone used or a breach that something made. The storage areas and loading docks visible in certain parts of Central Yharnam have their doors sealed not with standard locks, but with the kind of heavy padlocks used on commercial or institutional facilities. These seals suggest that whatever was stored in these facilities was considered valuable enough to protect even during the chaos of the hunt. Someone, in the middle of everything, took the time to lock the warehouse. The mechanism by which doors in Central Yharnam are eventually opened by the player, whether through keys, levers, or simply pushing, follows a logic that is mostly consistent with how those doors would work in reality. Keys open key-locked doors. Levers operate mechanically locked gates. And a few doors simply require force. The doors that require force are the ones that were not locked, but were merely stuck. And a door that is stuck rather than locked suggests it was last used in a hurry, jammed shut by someone leaving quickly rather than carefully secured. The existence of keys as collectible items in Central Yharnam implies a human who carried them, used them, and then dropped or lost them. Every key in the district has a story of the person who last held it, and that person's story is almost certainly one of transformation, death, or desperate flight. The key itself is the remaining evidence that someone once had the ability to lock and unlock specific spaces, and that they no longer have that ability. The underground sections of Central Yharnam contain locked doors of a different character than those above ground. Underground, the locks are older and more institutional, consistent with the different architectural language of the tunnels compared to the street-level buildings. These underground locks were not applied during the hunt. They predate it by years, possibly decades. Whatever they are containing has been contained for a long time. The workshop-like space accessible through one of Central Yharnam's unlocked doors contains equipment consistent with medical or alchemical work. The space itself is not explicitly labelled as anything specific, but the contents suggest it was used for processing biological material of some kind, and the locked cabinet in the corner of the room suggests that whatever was produced there was valuable or dangerous enough to warrant secure. storage even in a workspace that already required a key to enter. The doors in Central Yharnam that appear ornate or decorated are a category worth noting, because they suggest that not all of Central Yharnam was equally prosperous. The ornate doors belong to buildings that were homes or establishments of higher social status, and those buildings tend to be concentrated in specific areas of the district. The social geography of Central Yharnam, the question of who lived where and why, is partly readable through the quality of its door hardware. The fire-damaged doors in Central Yharnam are clustered in areas that saw specific fire events rather than random burning, which suggests the fires in this district were not accidental, but were set deliberately in specific locations. The targets of those deliberate fires, the buildings whose doors are most heavily damaged by fire, include what appear to have been gathering places, community spaces where large numbers of people might have been. The implications of deliberately setting fire to gathering places filled with people during a transformation outbreak are dark enough that the game seems to prefer leaving them implied rather than stated. The door at the top of the very long staircase near the central section of the district leads to one of the most elevated accessible positions in Central Yharnam, and from that position you can see much of the district laid out below. Whoever used this door regularly had an elevated view of the neighbourhood, which is the kind of advantage that either a watchman or a tactician would value. The door itself is unlocked, suggesting whoever used it last either left in a hurry or never had reason to lock it, because they never expected to need to keep anyone out. The relationship between locked doors and item placement in Central Yharnam follows a consistent pattern whereby the most significant items tend to be behind the most resistant barriers. This is game design logic, but within the fiction, it also reflects a truth about why things get locked away. The most important items were the most carefully secured, and the most carefully secured items required the most organizational capacity to lock away, which means the most significant items in Central Yharnam were secured by whoever in this district had the most power. The double lock door near the canal access point has two separate locking mechanisms, one that is standard and one that appears to be improvised and applied after the fact. The standard lock was there when the building was built. The improvised second lock was added later, during the hunt or immediately before it, by someone who felt that one lock was not enough. That escalation of security from one lock to two reflects a specific moment of fear when someone decided that the standard precautions were insufficient. The doors that are locked from the outside with locks that the player cannot interact with are, in game design terms, simply barriers. But in lore terms, they are statements about what the game chooses not to show. They are acknowledgements that Central Yharnam contains spaces the player will never see, events the player will never witness, and mysteries that are sealed away not because the game ran out of content budget, but because some things are meant to remain inaccessible. The locked door as a narrative device is one of Bloodborne's most deliberate choices. The building near the first brick troll that has every exterior opening sealed, but that contains sounds, audible through the walls, is one of the most unsettling environmental details in Central Yharnam. The sound suggests something inside, something still moving and active, sealed in by external locks. Whether those sounds are beast sounds, human sounds, or something in between, depends on how carefully you listen and how charitable your interpretation is. The game offers no clear answer. The locked gate that separates the upper rooftop section of Central Yharnam from the lower rooftop section requires a specific navigation path to circumvent, and that navigation path takes you through spaces you would not otherwise need to enter. This is level design forcing exploration, but the physical reality of the gate within the fiction suggests that the two rooftop sections were administered separately, with movement between them controlled, even in a district as apparently middle class and unremarkable as Central Yharnam. The trapdoors in certain areas of Central Yharnam are locked in ways that suggest they were sealed by the people below rather than the people above, which implies the spaces beneath the trapdoors were occupied during the hunt, and the occupants chose to seal themselves in rather than come up. Whether that was a reasonable decision, given what was happening above ground, is debatable. What they were sealing themselves away from is not debatable. It was the same thing everyone in Central Yharnam was sealing themselves away from. The locked doors of Central Yharnam collectively describe a district in the process of fragmenting. What was once a connected community with open streets and accessible buildings became, during the hunt, a collection of sealed boxes, each containing its own tragedy, each cut off from the others by wood and iron and fear. The locked doors are not simply obstacles for the player. They are the physical record of a community's last attempts to protect itself from something it did not understand and could not stop. The final door in Central Yharnam, the one that connects the district to the next major area of the game, is not locked in the traditional sense. It requires a boss key, the trophy of defeating the cleric beast, which is the game's way of saying that the next area is not physically sealed, but experientially sealed. You cannot go forward in Yharnam without having confronted what Central Yharnam represents, without having faced the transformed cleric and understood what that transformation means. The locked door, in this case, is inside the player rather than in the architecture. The overall message of Central Yharnam's locked doors is that security creates the illusion of safety without the reality of it. Every locked door in the district failed. The residents who locked themselves inside are gone. The containment officers who locked the exteriors of buildings did not contain anything. The storage facilities whose padlocks protected valuable cargo now sit sealed over whatever is or was inside. The locks remain, but everything they were supposed to protect is already gone. The architectural language of locked doors in Central Yharnam is ultimately a language of failure. These are not successful security measures. They are the archaeological record of security measures that were tried and did not work, implemented under catastrophic circumstances by people who were doing the best they could with the understanding they had. Every locked door in Central Yharnam is someone's last-ditch effort, and every locked door in Central Yharnam was not enough. The irony that the player, an outsider arriving after the fact, can open many of these doors with relatively simple means, speaks to how inadequate the locks actually were. The doors that locked a panicking resident inside their home against the hunt are the same doors that a hunter can simply kick open or bypass. The protection they offered was psychological as much as physical, the comfort of a barrier between oneself and the incomprehensible, even if that barrier was never truly sufficient. Chapter 4. What the Blood River Knows. The river of blood flowing through the lower sections of Central Yharnam is one of those details that players notice immediately, but process only at the level of spectacle. It is visually striking enough that the narrative function it serves tends to get overshadowed by the sheer wrongness of the image itself. But the Blood River is not simply set dressing. It is evidence of something specific that happened in this district. The volume of blood required to create and sustain a flowing river, even a narrow one, is enormous. Bodies contain somewhere between 4 and 6 litres of blood. To create a river of the size visible in Central Yharnam would require the blood of hundreds, if not thousands, of individuals. This is not the ambient residue of a single night's violence. This is a quantity of blood that implies industrial-scale collection or processing. The direction of flow of the Blood River is worth tracking. It flows from the upper sections of Central Yharnam toward the canal system below, which means its source is somewhere in the district above, not below. The blood is not welling up from underground. It is running down from somewhere above, accumulating as it descends, and eventually draining into the larger canal network. Something is producing this blood at the top of the system. The colour of the blood in the river is not uniform. There are sections that are darker, almost black, and sections that are a brighter, more oxygenated red, and sections that appear to have a different viscosity than normal blood. These variations suggest that the river is not drawing from a single source, but from multiple sources. some of which are producing blood of different qualities or at different rates. The mixing of these sources happens as the river descends. The creatures that gather at the edge of the blood river, as noted in the previous chapter, do not enter it. Their avoidance behaviour is consistent across different enemy types, which suggests it is not individual variation, but a species-level response to something about this particular blood. Whatever quality distinguishes the blood in the river from the ambient blood scattered throughout the rest of Central Yharnam is sufficient to repel creatures that are otherwise clearly drawn to blood. The edges of the blood river show structural modification. The channel through which it flows is not a natural formation. It has been shaped and lined with specific materials, some of which are consistent with architectural stone, and some of which are not clearly identifiable. Someone constructed the infrastructure for this river. It did not simply appear, it was built, or it was adapted from existing infrastructure for this purpose. The smell of the blood river, which the game can only gesture at through ambient audio and visual design, is something that several characters in the game appear to react to when in proximity to it. The lantern areas near the river have a quality of ambient sound that differs from lantern areas elsewhere, and the implied narrative reason for this difference is that the blood river affects the quality of the dream space in some way. The blood is not simply a physical substance in Central Yharnam. It has properties that extend beyond the physical. The foam or froth visible in certain sections of the blood river suggests oxidation or agitation somewhere upstream. Blood froths when it is aerated, which happens when it falls from a height or is agitated mechanically. Something upstream is causing the blood to become aerated before it reaches the main channel, which again suggests active processing rather than simple passive accumulation. The items that can be found in the blood river, if you navigate it carefully, are not the items you would expect from a simple flood of blood. Among the expected detritus, there are items that appear to have been deliberately placed or that sank to the bottom of the channel and remained there, suggesting the river has been flowing long enough for items to accumulate and settle. The river is not new. It has been flowing for long enough to develop a sediment layer. The origin point of the blood river is not clearly accessible or visible in Central Yharnam, which is a deliberate design choice. The game does not show you where the blood comes from. It shows you the result without the source, which is both a gameplay mystery and a thematic statement about the nature of the district's complicity in whatever produces the blood. Central Yharnam benefits from the Healing Church's ministrations. The blood river may be the cost of those ministrations, visible but unexplained. The historical question of when the blood river began is perhaps more important than the question of where it comes from. If the river predates the hunt, it suggests that whatever is producing this blood was already active in Central Yharnam long before the outbreak began, which would mean the conditions for the catastrophe were in place far earlier than the hunt's timing would suggest. If the river is a product of the hunt, it is still evidence of a volume and concentration of violence that exceeds what a single night of chaos would normally produce. The blood river connects physically to the larger canal system beneath Central Yharnam, which means whatever enters the blood river eventually reaches the underground network. The canal system, in turn, appears to connect to the lower sections of Yharnam and possibly to areas beyond the city walls. If the blood river is a transport mechanism, rather than simply an overflow, then whatever properties the blood carries are being distributed through the entire underground network of the city. The ritual significance of blood in the lore of Bloodborne makes the blood river more than simply a physical phenomenon. Blood ministration, blood healing, the old blood, all of these concepts treat blood as a medium for transformation and transcendence. A river of blood flowing through the centre of a district closely associated with the Healing Church is not simply gross, it is liturgical. The blood river may be the most explicit expression of the Church's sacramental relationship with blood made visible in physical infrastructure. The specific section of Central Yharnam through which the blood river flows is notable because it passes through the area that appears to have been the most densely populated part of the district. The blood river does not flow through the margins of the district or through its industrial sections. It flows through the heart of the community, through the streets that people lived on, which means the residents of Central Yharnam lived alongside this blood river. It was part of their environment, presumably for years before the hunt. The normalization of the blood river by the residents of Central Yharnam is implied by its structural integration into the district. It is not a feature that was hidden or contained. It flows openly through the streets. The residents knew it was there, and presumably they accepted it, either because the church told them it was beneficial or necessary, or because the ministration of Old Blood had already begun to alter their perception of what was normal. The blood river is what Central Yharnam thought of as ordinary. The animal behaviour around the blood river is not limited to the transformed beasts. The crows, which are unmutated natural birds, also maintain a particular relationship with the river, gathering near its banks but not in the flow itself. Crows are scavengers that will eat almost anything, but they do not touch the blood river. This cross-species avoidance behaviour, spanning both transformed and untransformed creatures, suggests something about the blood river that transcends species-specific responses and points to a universal repellent quality in whatever that blood contains. The temperature of the blood river is implied to be warmer than ambient temperature by the way vapour or steam appears to rise from it in certain lighting conditions. Fresh blood is warm. Blood that has been sitting in a cold stone channel for any length of time would cool. The continued warmth of the blood river suggests either that it is being continuously replenished with fresh blood from an active source, or that the blood has properties that allow it to maintain warmth independently, which would be consistent with the supernatural qualities attributed to Old Blood elsewhere in the game's lore. The surface tension of the blood river, visible in the way objects interact with it, appears to be higher than normal blood would produce. Things that should sink into a liquid of blood's standard viscosity instead float on the surface of this river. This increased surface tension, if it is not simply a graphics engine artifact, suggests the blood's composition is unusual in ways that go beyond simply being blood from multiple sources. Something has changed about its fundamental physical properties. The way light behaves in the blood river is also unusual. The river does not simply reflect light the way a normal dark liquid would. It has an internal quality, as if the blood itself has a faint luminescence, which in the context of the game's lore would be consistent with blood that has significant concentrations of whatever makes the Old Blood supernatural. The light in the blood is the light of the things that made Yharnam what it is, preserved in its most literal form. The intersection of the blood river with the city's water infrastructure is a contamination event of staggering proportions if the water system was still active when the river began to flow. If the city's water supplies drew from the same underground network that the blood river feeds into, then the blood, and whatever it carries, would have entered the drinking water of Yharnam at some point before the hunt. The timing of the blood river's origin, relative to the timeline of the outbreak, might explain why the transformation seems to have been so rapid and so thorough. The blood river of Central Yharnam is ultimately the district's most honest feature. Everything else in the district, the locked doors, the sealed windows, the maintained fires, is an attempt by someone or something to control or manage or deny the situation. The blood river simply flows. It does not lock itself. It does not hide. It moves through the centre of the district, carrying whatever it carries, going where it goes, answering to no authority and offering no comfort. In a game full of things that are hidden and implied and suggested, the blood river is simply present, in plain sight, doing what it does. The question the blood river raises, more than any other mystery in Central Yharnam, is not where it comes from, or what it contains. The question is what it took for the residents of this district to look at a river of blood flowing through their streets and decide that this was acceptable. That answer is not in the blood river itself. It is in everything else in Central Yharnam, in the locked doors and the beast behaviour and the burned buildings. in the accumulated evidence of a community that had been slowly convinced by degrees that extraordinary things were ordinary, until the extraordinary consumed them entirely. Chapter 5. The Healing Church's Shadow. The Healing Church does not have a visible building in Central Yharnam in the way that it has a visible presence in Cathedral Ward. But its influence over the district is everywhere once you know what to look for. Central Yharnam is not just adjacent to the church's power. It was shaped by it, administered through it, and ultimately destroyed by it. The first sign of church influence in Central Yharnam is architectural. The decorative language used on several of the district's significant buildings, the ornate stonework, the specific types of relief carving on doorways and window frames, matches the decorative language of the Healing Church's own structures in Cathedral Ward. These buildings were not simply influenced by church aesthetics. They were built by church-affiliated craftsmen using church-specified designs. The church had a physical hand in constructing Central Yharnam. The positioning of certain buildings in Central Yharnam relative to the overall layout of Yharnam suggests that they served as church satellite facilities rather than purely residential or civic structures. They are positioned in ways that maximize their accessibility from multiple parts of the district while also maintaining a clear sightline or path to the cathedral area above. These are branch locations for church operations, embedded in the heart of a residential district. The blood ministration clinics that the Healing Church operated were not confined to Cathedral Ward. They had neighbourhood-level distribution points throughout the city, and Central Yharnam, as one of the most densely populated districts, would have had multiple such distribution points. The buildings most consistent with serving as ministration clinics in Central Yharnam are identifiable by their combination of medical architecture and religious iconography. Clinical spaces that have been decorated with church symbols. The church's influence over Central Yharnam extended beyond the physical. The social structure of the district appears to have been mediated through church institutions. The community gathering spaces, the equivalent of meeting halls or commons, have architectural features that tie them to church functions. The community events of Central Yharnam were church events. The social life of the district was organised around church participation, which means the church had access to every layer of community life in this neighbourhood. The Healing Church's specific interest in Central Yharnam, as opposed to other districts of Yharnam, may relate to the district's position within the city's underground network. The canals and tunnels beneath Central Yharnam connect to regions of the city that are of particular interest to the church's more esoteric research programs. Central Yharnam was not simply a convenient ministry location. It was a strategic position in the underground geography of Yharnam. The evidence of medical experimentation in Central Yharnam goes beyond what simple blood ministration would require. The equipment visible in certain accessible buildings and the waste materials visible in certain areas of the underground sections suggest procedures more invasive and more experimental than the standard ministration that the church offered to the public. Central Yharnam was not just a place where the church distributed its products, it was a place where the church refined them. The church's presence in Central Yharnam helps explain the unusually high beast conversion rate noted in the first chapter. If Central Yharnam had more intensive church activity than other districts, including more experimental ministrations and higher concentrations of old blood in its medical treatments, then its residents would have been more thoroughly exposed to the transformative properties of that blood than residents of other districts. The church's generosity with Central Yharnam was the district's undoing. The specific church operatives whose presence can be inferred in Central Yharnam include not just standard ministry personnel, but also members of more specialised church branches. The evidence for this is in the items and equipment found throughout the district, which includes materials associated with church factions that would not normally operate in a standard ministry context. The church was running multiple types of operations in Central Yharnam, not all of them sanctioned by the church's official public functions. The church's response to the outbreak in Central Yharnam is one of the most damning implied narratives in the game. The evidence suggests that the church was aware of what was happening in the district before the general hunt was declared, and that their initial response was not evacuation or treatment, but containment and documentation. The exterior locks on certain buildings described in the previous chapter may represent church containment efforts rather than survivor barricades. The church's documentation impulse, evident throughout the game's lore, would have applied to Central Yharnam's outbreak as well. Someone was observing and recording what happened in this district, and those records, like the physical records hidden in the game's various chests and item pickups, are scattered throughout the area for the player to find in fragmentary form. The church treated Central Yharnam's catastrophe as data. The specific timing of the church's withdrawal from Central Yharnam is implied by the state of the district. The church did not simply fail to prevent the outbreak. It appears to have been present during the early phases of the outbreak, and then withdrew at some point, leaving the district's residents to whatever was coming. The withdrawal was organised enough to remove church personnel and specific church materials. But it happened quickly enough that other things, documents, equipment, people who were not prioritised for extraction, were left behind. The healing church's shadow over Central Yharnam is most visible in what is absent rather than what is present. The church has no visible representatives remaining in the district by the time the player arrives. All of its operational infrastructure has been either abandoned or sealed. The buildings associated with church activity are among the most thoroughly locked in the district. The church cleaned up after itself, or tried to, before it left Central Yharnam behind. The items of specifically church-affiliated significance found in Central Yharnam are not where you would expect to find them if the church had conducted a thorough withdrawal. They are in unusual locations, suggesting they were hidden rather than left accidentally, or that they were moved from their original locations during the chaos of the outbreak before being abandoned. Someone within the church attempted to conceal specific materials in Central Yharnam, and those materials are still there for the player to find. The church's relationship with the hunters who operated in Central Yharnam is complicated by the evidence found in the district. Standard church-affiliated hunters would have operated with church sanction and support. But some of the hunter-associated evidence in Central Yharnam suggests operations that were either unsanctioned or specifically hidden from the church's official record. There may have been hunters in Central Yharnam who were working against church interests, even as they appeared to work within them. The architecture of church authority in Central Yharnam operated through networks of obligation and dependency, rather than through explicit coercion. The residents of the district received medical treatment from the church, which in a city with Yharnam's disease rates would have created enormous gratitude and loyalty. They participated in church social institutions, which created community bonds that were simultaneously genuine community ties and mechanisms of church control. The church's grip on Central Yharnam was the grip of a benefactor. The transformation of that benefactor relationship into the mechanism of Central Yharnam's destruction is the core tragedy of the district. The people who took the blood ministrations that the church provided were not foolish or weak. They were sick, and the church offered healing, and the healing worked, right up until it didn't. The beasts of Central Yharnam are not the punishment for trusting the church. They are the church's ministrations continuing to work, past the point where work becomes catastrophe. The specific church doctrine that governed blood ministration practice suggests that increasing the dosage of ministration was considered beneficial, that more exposure to the old blood produced greater healing and greater connection to the church's divine source. Central Yharnam's residents, who had access to church facilities and church personnel in their immediate neighbourhood, may have been receiving more intensive ministrations than residents of districts with less church presence. The church's attention was not a gift, it was an overdose. The evidence of church rituals in Central Yharnam goes beyond the ministration clinics. There are spaces in the district whose function is clearly ceremonial rather than medical, with decorative and structural features consistent with ritual use rather than treatment. The church was conducting ceremonies in Central Yharnam, not just providing medical services, and those ceremonies appear to have involved the use of old blood in quantities and in ways that went well beyond what would be standard medical practice. The relationship between the cleric beast, the boss of Central Yharnam, and the healing church is the most explicit statement the district makes about the church's culpability. A cleric, a member of the church's own ordained personnel, has undergone the most extreme form of the transformation that the church's blood ministrations produce. The first boss of the game is a church official who became exactly the thing the church is supposed to prevent. That is not a coincidence. That is an argument that the game is making in the clearest possible terms. The church's legacy in Central Yharnam is a district that was built up through church investment, organised around church institutions, sustained through church medicines, and ultimately destroyed through church practices. The buildings that the church helped construct are now filled with beasts created by church blood. The community spaces the church organised are now territorial grounds for transformed residents. The medical clinics where church treatments were administered are now sealed-up mysteries. The church came to Central Yharnam, and Central Yharnam is what it left behind. The question of whether the church knew what it was doing, whether the transformation of Central Yharnam was an accident, an acceptable risk, or a deliberate experiment, is one that the game raises without settling. The evidence in Central Yharnam specifically points toward willful negligence at minimum and deliberate experimentation at maximum. The church knew enough about what the old blood did to understand the risk. Whether they disclosed that risk to the residents of Central Yharnam is answered by the locked doors and the blood river and the beasts in the streets. The shadow of the church falls across every mystery in Central Yharnam, not because the church is the explanation for all of them, but because the church is the institution that had the most presence, the most power, and the most to answer for in this district. Every locked door might be a church containment effort. Every burning brazier might be a church signal. Every item found in unexpected places might be church evidence that someone tried to hide. The church is the interpretive lens through which Central Yharnam's mysteries become most coherent, and Central Yharnam is the most damning evidence against the church available anywhere in the game's early hours. The residents of Central Yharnam trusted the healing church because the healing church was trustworthy in the ways that matter most to ordinary people. The church healed the sick. The church organised the community. The church gave people something to believe in, larger than their immediate circumstances. Those are real and valuable gifts. The fact that they were given in service of something that ultimately destroyed the people who received them does not make the gifts less real. It makes the betrayal more complete. Central Yharnam trusted the church with everything, and the church spent that trust in ways the district's residents never agreed to, never understood, and never recovered from. Chapter 6. The Architecture of Guilt. There is a way that buildings confess things. Not in the way that documents confess, with explicit statements that can be read and disputed and reinterpreted. Buildings confess through their proportions, through the relationship between the spaces that were meant to be seen and the spaces that were meant to be hidden, through the gap between what a structure announces itself to be and what its interior actually requires. Central Yharnam's buildings confess constantly, and almost no one is listening. The most important architectural confession in Central Yharnam is the one made by the buildings that present a residential facade to the street, but whose interior dimensions, when you actually explore them, do not match that facade. From the outside, certain buildings in this district look like large family homes or modest commercial premises. Walk inside, and the interior is arranged in ways that make no sense for a home or a shop. The proportions are wrong. The room layouts are wrong. The placement of load-bearing elements is wrong in the specific way that suggests the building was designed with its true purpose in mind, and the residential facade was added later, or was always a cover story. The placement of ventilation infrastructure in several Central Yharnam buildings is another confession of this kind. Ventilation in a residential building is designed to move air for the comfort of inhabitants. The ventilation shafts in certain buildings in this district are positioned and sized for a different purpose. They are placed where you would put them if you needed to exhaust fumes from chemical processes, or if you needed to maintain specific atmospheric conditions in rooms that could not be left open to the street. Someone needed these buildings to breathe in a particular way, and that need was not residential. The staircases of Central Yharnam are worth studying in isolation from everything else they connect to. The width of a staircase is determined by how many people need to use it simultaneously, and in which direction. Residential staircases are narrow because they accommodate a family moving between floors. Commercial staircases are wider. Institutional staircases, designed for the movement of groups, are wider still, and staircases designed to move large quantities of material or to allow the passage of equipment are wider in specific ways and have specific reinforcements in their treads that distinguish them from passenger stairs. Central Yharnam has staircases that are not residential stairs in disguise. They are institutional stairs in residential buildings, and nobody accidentally builds an institutional staircase in a house. The acoustic properties of Central Yharnam spaces are something that can only be inferred from the game's sound design, but they are worth inferring. Sound behaves differently depending on the size, shape, and material composition of the space it occupies. The way ambient audio reverberates in certain interior spaces of Central Yharnam suggests chambers larger than their apparent exterior dimensions would accommodate. This is not a graphics engine limitation. Bloodborne's designers were deliberate about audio design in ways that repay attention. When a room sounds larger than it looks, it is because something about that room's acoustics has been deliberately emphasized. Subterranean annexes, hollow spaces beneath floors, chambers behind walls. Central Yharnam has more interior volume than its exterior presence, and that excess volume was put there by someone with a reason to hide it. The windows of Central Yharnam that look onto other windows, rather than onto the street or into courtyards, form an internal network of sightlines within the district that has no obvious residential function. In a city, windows face outward, toward light and air and the life of the street. Windows that face other windows are windows that face inward, toward privacy and concealment. The buildings in Central Yharnam that have these inward-facing windows were built to observe each other, or to allow passage of light and communication between buildings that needed to be functionally connected without being physically connected. The district had internal connections that its streets did not advertise. The building materials used in Central Yharnam are not uniform, which is expected in a district that developed over time, but the non-uniformity has a pattern that is worth noticing. The oldest buildings, identifiable by weathering patterns and stylistic details, are built from a local stone that appears throughout Yharnam. Layered on top of this older construction, added to existing buildings or built between them, is a second generation of construction using imported materials. Stone that does not match the local geology. Timber worked in ways that require specialized tools not obviously present in a residential district. Metalwork of a precision inconsistent with standard construction. Someone brought materials and skills into Central Yharnam specifically to build something, and that something was embedded in the existing residential fabric in ways designed to obscure it. The relationship between the buildings that back onto the canal system and the canal system itself is not simply one of proximity. Certain buildings in Central Yharnam have basement-level access points that connect directly to the canal infrastructure below, not doors that happen to be near the canal, but designed connections, with purpose-built passages and in some cases what appear to be loading or transfer facilities. Materials were moved between the canal network and these buildings directly, bypassing the street level entirely. What moved through those connections, and in which direction, is one of the district's most carefully concealed questions. The lack of certain types of buildings that would be expected in a residential district of Central Yharnam's apparent size and density is as revealing as what is present. A district of this population would typically have multiple taverns or social drinking establishments. It would have a laundry facility or the infrastructure for distributed domestic laundry. It would have a fire brigade station or at least dedicated firefighting equipment depots. Central Yharnam has none of these things, or rather, none of them are visible at street level. Their absence suggests either that Central Yharnam was unusual enough in its social organisation to not require these standard urban services, or that the buildings that house these services have been so thoroughly repurposed or destroyed that their original function is no longer identifiable, or that what appears to be a residential district was never quite as residential as its surface suggested. The floor plans of the interior spaces accessible in Central Yharnam, when mapped, reveal a peculiarity in the distribution of open-plan versus compartmentalised spaces. Residential buildings tend toward compartmentalisation because rooms serve different domestic functions and benefit from separation. The interior spaces of certain Central Yharnam buildings are organised in the opposite direction, with large undivided areas that could accommodate either group activities or equipment on a scale that no residential family would require. The furniture and fixtures in these spaces, where identifiable, are also not residential furniture. They are the furniture of work, of process, of operation. The height of the ceilings in certain interior spaces of Central Yharnam is architecturally inconsistent with the floors above them. Residential buildings optimize their height allocation to maximize floor count. A building with higher ceilings than its residential program requires is a building that was designed for something that needed that height, whether for equipment clearance, for the movement of materials by rope and pulley, or for the management of atmospheric conditions in spaces where ceiling height affects the behavior of gases or vapors. The high ceiling spaces of Central Yharnam are not there for grandeur. They are there because something required them. The orientation of buildings in Central Yharnam, relative to the direction of prevailing winds, is an architectural detail that goes unnoticed in most environments, but which, in a district with unusual ventilation needs, becomes significant. Buildings that need to exhaust harmful vapours are oriented to take advantage of prevailing winds for natural ventilation. Buildings that need to exclude outside air are oriented to minimise their exposure to it. The orientations of certain Central Yharnam buildings make no sense from the perspective of optimising for light and comfort, which is what residential buildings optimise for, but make considerable sense from the perspective of managing airflow for industrial or chemical processes. The roof structures of Central Yharnam, visible from elevated positions and from the rooftop exploration sections, include elements that are not standard residential roofing. Certain structures on rooftops that might be dismissed as chimneys or access hatches are positioned and proportioned in ways more consistent with laboratory or processing exhaust systems than with domestic heating. These roof-level elements connect to the ventilation systems inside the buildings below, and together they describe buildings that were managed atmospherically in ways that exceed any residential or simple commercial requirement. The guilt that Central Yharnam's architecture confesses is the guilt of concealment, not concealment of individual actions, but concealment of systematic practice. The buildings of this district were modified and constructed to hide the fact that something was being done here at scale, over a long period, with institutional resources and institutional intent. Whatever was done in Central Yharnam left its mark in the architecture, because architecture is the hardest thing to change after the fact. You can burn documents, you can silence witnesses, you can reclassify records, but you cannot easily unbuild an institutional staircase in a residential building, or re-narrow a ventilation shaft, or remove the loading access points that connect a building to the canal system beneath it. The buildings of Central Yharnam were built to hide what was happening inside them, And they confessed anyway, in stone and timber, and the precise placement of things that should not be where they are. The final architectural confession of Central Yharnam is the most damning, and it is the one made by the overall layout of the district as a whole. When you look at Central Yharnam from above, when you have the map in your head and can think about the district as a spatial system rather than as a sequence of rooms you move through, what you see is not the organic development pattern of a residential community. Residential communities grow outward from centres of commerce or worship in patterns that reflect individual decisions made over time. Central Yharnam grew around something. The district is organised in relation to a central set of functions that shaped everything around them. The residential fabric is not the city. It is the cover for what is at the city's centre. And what is at Central Yharnam's centre, buried beneath the streets and embedded in the buildings and flowing in the canal beneath everything, is what the Healing Church installed there before any of the residents arrived, and what it left there after all of them were gone. Chapter 7. The Social Order of the Damned. Yharnam before the Hunt was a city with a functioning social hierarchy, and that hierarchy left fossil traces throughout Central Yharnam that can be read in the same way that a geologist reads rock strata. The different layers of social organisation that existed in this district are still present in the distribution of wealth markers, in the quality of surviving material culture, in the spatial geography of who lived where and how, and in the pattern of who was transformed and who was not, or more. Precisely in which direction the violence of the transformation moved. The material culture of Central Yharnam's residents is preserved in the items that can be found throughout the district, dropped by enemies, tucked into corners, or sitting in the spaces that inhabitants occupied. Reading this material culture as an inventory of what different social classes carried with them on the night of the hunt tells you more about the district's social structure than any explicit description could. The enemies that drop coins and basic consumables were working people. The enemies that drop more valuable items were people of higher economic standing, and the enemies that drop hunter-associated equipment were either hunters themselves or people close enough to hunter networks to have access to their supplies. The spatial distribution of this material culture follows a pattern that reflects the social geography of the district in life. The lower status items cluster in the areas of smaller, more densely packed buildings, in the narrow streets and cramped interiors of what was clearly a working-class neighbourhood. The higher status items cluster in the larger buildings near the district's civic centre, in the areas with wider streets and more elaborate architectural detail. The hunter-associated items are distributed along specific routes through the district that correspond to paths a hunter would logically take, suggesting that at some point hunters moved through this area and the items they dropped or abandoned fell where their bodies fell. The relationship between social status and survival during the hunt is one of the most uncomfortable implications of Central Yharnam's ecology. If the transformation came from blood ministrations provided by the Healing Church, and if the access to ministrations was tiered by social class, then the transformation itself was socially distributed. Wealthier residents, who could afford more intensive or frequent ministrations, would have been more thoroughly exposed to the transformative properties of the old blood. The Church's most enthusiastic customers were also the ones most likely to transform. In Central Yharnam, the disease of bestial transformation may have moved upward through the social hierarchy before moving downward, which would mean that the most dangerous enemies in the district are not the poor and the marginalised, but the people who had the most access to what the Church was. Selling. The servants and workers whose presence is implied by the larger households in Central Yharnam occupy a strange position in this framework. They would have had less access to ministrations than their employers, but more proximity to the symptoms of transformation as it began to affect the upper-class households they served. The first warnings of what was coming, if any warnings were possible, would have been witnessed by servants. The question of what the servants of Central Yharnam did with what they witnessed, whether they fled or reported or stayed or themselves succumbed, is one that the environment raises and cannot fully answer. The children of Central Yharnam are absent from the district in a way that is worth marking. There are no small enemies in Central Yharnam. There are no transformed children. The architecture of certain buildings includes spaces consistent with children's occupation, schoolrooms or playrooms or nurseries of a domestic scale. But there are no children in them. The absence of children from Central Yharnam during the hunt is not unusual. Children are absent from most of Bloodborne's environments. But the specific form of that absence here, the presence of child-scale spaces without children in them, suggests that the children of Central Yharnam were removed from the district before the worst of what happened here came to pass. Someone prioritised evacuating the children. Someone made that decision and carried it out. That decision implies both awareness of what was coming and some capacity to act on that awareness, and both of those things point toward the Healing Church having more foreknowledge of the hunt than it claims. The elderly residents of Central Yharnam are represented among the enemies in a way that can be inferred from certain enemy models and behaviours. The game does not explicitly flag enemies as elderly, but certain enemies move with a gait and employ tactics consistent with reduced physical capacity compensated for by experience and cunning. These are not the fast, aggressive beasts of the district. They are the methodical, difficult to surprise beasts. If these enemies were elderly humans before their transformation, their behaviour after transformation reflects the persistence of a particular kind of wisdom, the wisdom of someone who has been in dangerous situations before and has developed strategies for managing them. The old ones of Central Yharnam are in some ways the most dangerous, because what they lost in physical speed they made up for in retained tactical sense. The merchants and traders who operated in what appears to have been Central Yharnam's commercial quarter left traces of their former occupations in the items found near their transformed bodies. The weights and scales that appear in certain areas of the district imply commerce. The remnants of stock and inventory near certain buildings imply the storerooms of shops. The professional relationship between merchants and the Healing Church, which would have been a relationship of dependency, since the church controlled health, and with health came prosperity, or its absence, would have created a particular kind of motivated compliance among the district's commercial class. These were people who could not afford to question the church, because their livelihoods depended on the continued health of their customers, and the continued health of their customers depended on the church's goodwill. The merchants of Central Yharnam did not resist because they had too much to lose. The craftspeople of Central Yharnam, identifiable through the tools and workshop equipment visible in certain accessible buildings, represent a different category of the district's social order. Craftspeople in a pre-industrial urban environment occupied a middle social position with particular characteristics. They were skilled enough to have some economic independence, but embedded enough in local networks to be subject to communal pressures. Their relationship with the Healing Church would have been one of both consumer and supplier, since the church required skilled labour for the construction and maintenance of its facilities and equipment. The craftspeople who built the modified buildings of Central Yharnam, who installed the institutional staircases and the non-residential ventilation systems and the loading access points to the canal, knew what they were building. They may not have known why. But they built it, and they were paid for it, and that transaction makes them participants in whatever happened. The religious laypeople of Central Yharnam, those who participated in church institutions without being church officials, represent the largest single category of the district's social order. In a city where the Healing Church had organised the social life of the district around its functions, the average resident's relationship with the church was not simply that of a patient with a hospital. It was the relationship of a parishioner with their church, a relationship that combined spiritual meaning with social belonging, with access to essential services. Leaving the church's embrace in Central Yharnam would not simply have been a medical decision or a philosophical one. It would have been a social exile. The community that organised around church participation would have viewed departure from that community as a kind of death, and for many residents, That meant they stayed even when staying became dangerous. Because the alternative, isolation from the only community they had known, seemed worse. The physicians and medical practitioners, who were not church officials, but who operated within the church's medical framework, represent a category of special interest in Central Yharnam. These were people with enough scientific knowledge to potentially understand what was happening as it happened, who had access to the same materials and procedures that were causing the transformation, and who would have been among the first to observe symptoms that deviated from expected outcomes. The medical practitioners of Central Yharnam either became complicit in concealing what was happening, or they raised objections that were suppressed, or they themselves became early victims of the transformation that they had more access to than their patients. The game does not give us a surviving doctor character in Central Yharnam, which is itself suggestive. The people who might have known enough to explain what was happening are gone, completely, in a way that leaves no trace. The social order of Central Yharnam did not simply dissolve during the hunt. It transformed along with its participants. The hierarchies that existed in human life appear to persist, in distorted form, in the beast ecology of the district. The territories that the different beast populations occupy roughly correspond to the social territories of the human communities that preceded them. The behaviours that different enemy types exhibit reflect the occupational identities of their human predecessors. The social order of Central Yharnam is still there, recognisable if you know how to look, encoded in the spatial arrangement and the behavioural ecology of the things that used to be people. The beasts of Central Yharnam are not a new social order. They are the old social order, continued past the point where it could sustain any of the things that made it meaningful. The tragedy of Central Yharnam's social order is the tragedy of a community that was real and functional, and then was destroyed by the very institution that had made it real and functional. The relationships between neighbours, between merchants and customers, between clergy and lay people, between the skilled and the unskilled, were the fabric of a genuine community. That fabric was built on a foundation that was poisoned, and when the poison worked itself through the foundation, the entire fabric came apart in ways that left no survivors and no one to mourn what was lost. The social order of Central Yharnam was a living thing, and what the hunt produced was not its transformation, but its negation, a negative space in the shape of a community, haunted by the persistence of habits and territories and hierarchies that no longer have any people to maintain them. Chapter 8. The Night Before the Hunt. The hunt does not begin at the beginning of the game. It was already underway. The world the player steps into when they descend into Central Yharnam is not the world at the moment of catastrophe. It is the world after catastrophe, hours or days or longer, into a process that was already in motion. Understanding Central Yharnam requires reconstructing the period before the player arrives, the actual night of the hunt's beginning, and the events that led from a functional if troubled district to the smoking ruin that the player inherits. The environmental evidence for the timeline of Central Yharnam's destruction can be read in layers. The oldest layer of damage, identifiable by the depth of bloodstaining, the degree of structural damage, and the extent to which fire has burned itself out, is in the areas nearest the canal and the underground sections of the district. Whatever happened first happened below. The destruction moved upward through the district over time, which is consistent with something emerging from the underground infrastructure of the district and spreading outward and upward from there. The fires of Central Yharnam are in different stages. Some have burned out entirely, leaving only ash and scorched stone. Some are still burning actively, and some appear to have been recently lit, burning more cleanly with less accumulated ash than the older fires. These three fire states describe a timeline. The fires that have burned out mark the locations where the violence peaked earliest. The fires still burning mark ongoing danger zones. And the recently lit fires, if there are people or quasi-people tending them, mark the locations where whatever minimal organisation remains in Central Yharnam is concentrated. The barricades of Central Yharnam tell a timeline story through their quality. The earliest barricades, built before the situation became dire, are substantial and thoughtful. They use heavy materials, they are reinforced at their load-bearing points, and they show evidence of planned construction rather than improvised panic. Later barricades are progressively more desperate, using lighter materials with less structural integrity, built more quickly as the time available for construction shortened. The last barricades are barely functional, pushed into position by people who had only minutes to act. Reading the barricades from substantial to desperate traces the arc of Central Yharnam's fall. The position of bodies, identifiable through the placement of item drops that cluster where enemies were originally located before player disturbance, suggests the distribution of the early casualties. The first casualties of whatever happened in Central Yharnam were clustered in specific areas that correspond to the district's underground access points, its canal connections, and its church-affiliated facilities. The people who died first were the people closest to whatever came out of the underground sections of the district, or the people who were present when church facilities began to fail in the ways that preceded the transformation becoming uncontrollable. The evidence of a warning system in Central Yharnam is preserved in the placement of bells and signal fires. The district appears to have had some form of emergency communication infrastructure, because the pattern of fires and the placement of certain structures suggests that there were agreed upon alarm signals. Whether those signals were ever used, and whether they were effective in reaching anyone who could act on them, is impossible to determine from the current state of the district. But the infrastructure for warning existed, which means someone in Central Yharnam had anticipated the possibility that an emergency might need to be communicated across the district quickly. That level of preparedness implies foreknowledge of the kind of emergency that would require it. The night before the hunt in Central Yharnam, reconstructed from the environmental evidence, was probably not a single dramatic event. The evidence suggests a gradual escalation that reached catastrophic speed only at some point that was already too late to arrest. The first signs were probably medical, people whose ministrations were producing unexpected symptoms, people whose transformations were beginning in ways that the standard medical language of the church could not adequately describe or categorize. These early cases would have been reported to church personnel, who would have applied church protocols, which may have involved isolation and additional treatment rather than quarantine and warning. The isolation protocols, if they were applied, would explain the distribution of locked rooms in certain Central Yharnam buildings. Someone who was experiencing pre-transformation symptoms would have been isolated in a room, locked in, monitored. The monitoring would have continued as long as there were church personnel available to conduct it. When the monitoring broke down, when the church personnel who had been assigned to watch these isolated individuals were themselves affected, the isolated individuals were simply left where they were. The rooms they were locked in became their tombs, or the containers that held whatever they became. The transition from managed crisis to unmanageable catastrophe in Central Yharnam happened at a specific moment that can be inferred from the environmental evidence, but not precisely dated. The moment was probably when the number of transformed individuals exceeded the capacity of available hunters to contain them. Before that moment, the hunt was a controlled operation, a suppression of individual transformation cases by trained personnel operating according to established protocols. After that moment, the hunt became what the player experiences, an environment in which the transformed are everywhere and the containment has failed completely. The hunters who were present in Central Yharnam before the containment failed were operating under conditions of extreme stress and probably under conflicting orders. The church, which deployed the hunters, would have wanted the situation managed quietly, with minimal public acknowledgement that anything extraordinary was happening. The hunters on the ground would have known that the situation was beyond quiet management. The tension between the church's institutional interest in discretion and the operational reality of the crisis would have created friction in the hunter chain of command, and the evidence of that friction may be preserved in certain aspects of the district's current state. The civilians of Central Yharnam, during the hours before the full outbreak, were responding to rumours and partial information rather than to official guidance. The official guidance, whatever form it took, was either not provided, not believed, or not adequate to the situation. The barricade patterns suggest that civilians were making their own defensive decisions based on what they could see and hear in their immediate neighbourhood rather than on any coordinated emergency response. A coordinated emergency response would have produced more uniform and more effective defensive preparations. The non-uniformity of Central Yharnam's defensive preparation is evidence of a community acting without central coordination, each household and neighbourhood making independent decisions about how to respond to a threat that was not being officially acknowledged. The church's decision to declare a hunt, to publicly acknowledge that the situation had passed the threshold of quiet management, was the decision that transformed the crisis from a controlled operation into a public emergency. Before the hunt was declared, Central Yharnam's residents were trying to manage an ambiguous situation with incomplete information. After the hunt was declared, they were trying to survive a named catastrophe. And the social mechanisms that function in ambiguous situations, caution, communication, community support, broke down in favour of the individual responses that characterised the final hours of the district. The night before the hunt in Central Yharnam was the last night that the district functioned as a community. The relationships between neighbours, the shared understanding of how the world worked, the trust in institutions and in each other that made daily life possible, all of these things existed on the night before the hunt and did not exist on the morning after it. What replaced them was not chaos, exactly. What replaced them was something more organised than chaos and more alien than order. The territorial behaviour of transformed individuals who retained enough of their former cognitive patterns to maintain spatial relationships, but not enough to maintain the social contract that made those spatial. Relationships meaningful. Central Yharnam on the night before the hunt was a community on the edge of dissolution. What it became after that edge was crossed is what the player inherits. Chapter 9. The Children of the Old Blood. The Old Blood is everywhere in Central Yharnam, and the Old Blood changes everything it touches. But the nature of that change, the specific form it takes in specific individuals and in specific concentrations, is not uniform. Central Yharnam is a laboratory in which different doses and different contexts of Old Blood exposure have produced different outcomes, and reading those different outcomes as a taxonomy of transformation reveals something about the nature of the substance that produced them. The most common form of transformation in Central Yharnam is the standard huntsman model, the human figure that has become bestial in posture, in strength, and in aggression, but has retained human form. These are the people who received ministrations at a level that pushed them toward the threshold of transformation, but did not carry them far past it. They are the product of the minimum effective dose of Old Blood exposure that produces the transformation, and their persistence in this intermediate state suggests that the transformation has a plateau, a point at which the process slows or stabilizes rather than continuing to the more extreme. Forms visible elsewhere in the district. The brick trolls, or whatever they were before they became the massive lumbering creatures that patrol certain areas of Central Yharnam, represent a different category of transformation. These are individuals who were exposed to significantly higher concentrations of Old Blood than the standard huntsman, or who had a specific physiological response to standard concentrations that produced more extreme physical changes. The size and power of these creatures suggests that the transformation, at sufficient intensity, produces not just behavioural change, but fundamental physical restructuring, a rewriting of the body's basic parameters of scale and strength. Whatever the brick trolls were, they were substantially rebuilt by whatever they received. The aquatic or semi-aquatic creatures in the canal and underground sections of Central Yharnam represent a third transformation category, one that suggests the environment of transformation matters as much as the dosage. Individuals who were exposed to the old blood in proximity to the canal network, or who spent time in the underground sections of the district during their transformation, produced outcomes that reflect their environmental context. The water and darkness of the underground spaces shaped the direction the transformation took, producing creatures adapted to those environments in ways that purely surface-level exposure does not. This suggests the old blood does not simply impose a fixed template of transformation, but interacts with the individual's circumstances to produce context-specific results. The crow-like creatures that appear in the elevated sections of Central Yharnam are perhaps the most unusual transformation product in the district, because they suggest either that the old blood affected non-human animals as well as humans, or that human individuals who were exposed at altitude, or who had particularly unusual physiological responses, produced something that no longer resembles a human being in any meaningful way. The crow-like creatures retain enough of whatever they were to move and act as coherent organisms, but what they were is no longer recognizable in what they have become. This represents the far end of the transformation spectrum in Central Yharnam, the point beyond which the connection to the original organism is theoretical rather than visible. The enemy that is on fire and still attacking, noted in an earlier chapter as an example of motivation stronger than the fear of death, is also an example of a specific transformation condition in which the physical changes have progressed far enough that the sensation of pain, or at least the behavioral response to pain, has been suppressed or eliminated. A human being on fire stops functioning within a very short time because the experience of burning produces physiological responses that override voluntary behavior. The transformed individual on fire has lost whatever mechanism suppressed voluntary behavior in favor of survival instinct. It continues to pursue its objectives while burning because it has no mechanism left that prioritizes its own survival over its transformed imperative. This is not bravery or madness. It is the absence of a specific self-preservation function that the transformation eliminated. The social behavior of certain enemy groups in Central Yharnam reveals something about whether the old blood preserves, destroys, or creates social bonds. The groups of enemies that appear to maintain loose affiliations, the ones that patrol near each other, that share territories, that react to each other's disturbances, suggest that the old blood does not eliminate social behavior entirely. What it appears to do is strip social behavior down to its most primitive components: proximity, shared territory, coordinated response to threats, while eliminating the higher-order social functions: communication, cooperation for complex goals, recognition of individual identity. The social groups of Central Yharnam's beasts are social in the way that schooling fish are social, reacting to each other in coordinated ways without any of the intentional social architecture that characterized their human communities. The exceptions to this pattern are the enemy groups that appear to organize around a dominant individual, where the hierarchy is not just proximity-based, but actively maintained through the behavior of the subordinate individuals. These groups suggest that certain transformation outcomes produce individuals with enough retained cognitive function to establish and maintain dominance relationships, and that the other transformed individuals in their vicinity have enough retained social responsiveness to recognize and respond to those dominance relationships. This is a higher-order social function than simple flocking behavior, and its presence in Central Yharnam suggests that some of the district's residents retained more cognitive function through their transformation than others, and that this differential retention has produced a primitive social stratification among the beasts. The cleric beast, when considered as a transformation outcome rather than simply as a boss encounter, represents what the old blood does when a highly trained individual with specific cognitive and physical capacities undergoes transformation at an extreme level. The cleric was a trained religious practitioner with whatever mental and physical disciplines that entailed. The transformation of such an individual does not simply produce a large aggressive beast. It produces something that has weaponized the capacities the individual possessed in life: enormous reach, physical power, and perhaps something of the former individual's relationship with the supernatural forces the Church worked with. The cleric beast is the most extreme transformation outcome visible in Central Yharnam, and it is not an accident that this extreme outcome belongs to a member of the institution most responsible for the transformations throughout the district. The relationship between the dose and duration of old blood exposure and the specific transformation outcome raises questions about the medical records of Central Yharnam that may exist somewhere in the district's sealed spaces. If the Church was conducting ministrations and documenting outcomes, as it did in its more official research facilities, then Central Yharnam has records of who received what, when, and how their response was initially categorized. Those records, if they still exist, are the most damning evidence in the district, because they would show that the transformation was tracked, that its progression was documented, and that the Church continued ministrations even as it was observing the outcomes. They would show that the children of the old blood were created knowingly. The philosophical question that the taxonomy of Central Yharnam's transformed residents raises is whether the individuals who survived in their transformed states are still the people they were before the transformation. The question is not simply academic. It bears on how the player is meant to understand the act of killing them. If the huntsmen are still, in some meaningful sense, the residents of Central Yharnam, then every one of them that the player kills is a person, an ending of something that began as a human life and was diverted by the Church's intervention and the old blood's action into something that, nevertheless, persists and suffers and acts according to its transformed nature. The game does not answer this question cleanly, but Central Yharnam keeps posing it in every face that turns toward the player with a mixture of aggression and something that might, in a different light, look like desperation. Chapter 10. The Hunters Who Came Before. The player is not the first hunter to move through Central Yharnam. The evidence of prior hunter activity is scattered throughout the district in ways that tell a story about what happened before the player arrived, and what it cost the hunters who preceded them. The most explicit evidence of prior hunter presence in Central Yharnam is the dead hunter NPC, whose body and notes provide the player with early guidance. This hunter was a real person who moved through this district, observed it, survived long enough to leave notes, and then died. The location of their body relative to the dangers in the district suggests they were killed relatively recently, in hunt time terms, which means they were present and active in this district after it had already become what the player finds. They were trying to survive in a place that had already fallen. The equipment scattered throughout Central Yharnam that has the character of hunter supply drops or caches rather than resident items tells a story of organized hunter activity. Hunters who were operating in Central Yharnam before the current hunt, or in its early hours, left supplies at specific locations. These were not accidents. These were deliberate placements by individuals who expected to return to those locations, or who were setting up resupply points for extended operations. The fact that the supplies are still there, uncollected, means the hunters who placed them did not return. Something prevented them from coming back to collect what they had cached. The bloodstains on certain surfaces in Central Yharnam, specifically the ones at heights and in positions inconsistent with beast combat, suggest that hunters were engaged in activities in this district beyond simply fighting transformed residents. The blood at height suggests hunters moving through elevated areas, across rooftops, along building facades, in ways consistent with infiltration or surveillance rather than straightforward combat. Someone was moving through Central Yharnam very carefully, trying not to be seen, and the blood they left behind indicates they were not entirely successful. The specific weapons and equipment that appear as item drops in unusual locations suggest that particular hunters who used particular weapons moved through particular areas of the district. This is speculative, but the clustering of specific equipment types in specific areas has enough consistency to suggest individual hunters, each with their preferred tools, moving through the district along particular routes. Reconstructing those routes from the item placement gives you a picture of how multiple hunters navigated Central Yharnam before the player arrived, and the routes they chose tell you something about what they were trying to do. The improvised fortifications that appear to have been made by hunters, distinct from the civilian barricades, are positioned to optimize combat effectiveness rather than simply to create barriers. Where a civilian barricade blocks a street as broadly as possible, a hunter fortification tends to funnel enemies into kill zones, to create covered positions with clear sight lines, to make use of the terrain in ways that suggest tactical thinking about how to engage specific numbers and types of enemies. These hunter fortifications are all abandoned now, which means the hunters who built them either succeeded in their immediate tactical objectives and moved on, or failed in them. The amount of blood in and around these positions suggests that some of each happened. The notes that surviving hunters apparently left throughout Central Yharnam, represented in the game by the blood messages on the ground, tell a fragmented story of what it was like to move through this district when the transformation was actively spreading rather than already complete. The messages cluster around danger points and near significant discoveries, which is the behaviour of someone trying to communicate useful information to whoever comes after them. The hunters who wrote these messages were thinking about successors. They knew they might not survive to carry their knowledge forward, and they tried to preserve it in the most durable form available: blood on stone. The hunter who apparently tried to reach the cleric beast and failed, whose presence can be inferred from the trail of items and bloodstains leading toward the boss encounter, was the hunter closest to succeeding at the primary objective that the encounter represents. This unnamed hunter navigated most of Central Yharnam, reached the approaches to the cleric beast, and did not come back. Their failure is what makes the player's arrival and eventual success significant. Not because the player is necessarily better than they were, but because the player arrives fresh, while every hunter who preceded them arrived, exhausted, depleted, carrying the weight of everything they had survived to reach that point. The relationship between the hunters who operated in Central Yharnam and the Healing Church is one of the more complicated aspects of the district's history. Some of these hunters were church-sanctioned, operating as the church's enforcers of the hunt's protocols. Others were independent hunters who may have been operating in opposition to church interests or simply outside church awareness. The distinction matters because it determines whose instructions these hunters were following and whose interests they were serving as they moved through the district and made the decisions they made. The church-sanctioned hunters in Central Yharnam would have been following containment protocols designed to manage the appearance of the crisis, rather than necessarily to resolve it most effectively. Their orders would have prioritized discretion over thoroughness, which means they may have chosen to lock and seal areas where a more aggressive approach would have required making the situation more visible. The independent hunters, if there were any operating in Central Yharnam, would have been making different decisions based on different priorities, potentially more effective at addressing the actual transformation outbreak, but less concerned with the political dimensions of what they were discovering. The evidence of hunter-on-hunter conflict in Central Yharnam is subtle, but present. Certain damage patterns on surfaces within the district are not consistent with beast origin damage. They are consistent with damage from hunter weapons, from firearms fired at close range, from bladed weapons wielded with the trained precision of a hunter. In these locations, hunters were fighting each other. Whether this represents conflicts between church-sanctioned and independent hunters, or conflicts within the church-sanctioned hunter hierarchy over what to do about what they were finding, or simply the psychological breakdown of individuals under extreme stress, the evidence of hunter on hunter. Violence in Central Yharnam is one of the district's most disturbing implications. The last hunter who passed through Central Yharnam before the player leaves no explicit body, because the last hunter who passed through was the one whose actions set the stage for the current state of the district. This hypothetical final hunter, the last person to move through Central Yharnam as a functioning agent before everything that remained of organisation in the district collapsed, would have witnessed the final stages of the breakdown, the moment when the last surviving organised human presence in the district either was transformed, fled, or was killed by things that were already transformed. What that hunter saw, and whether they escaped to report it, or simply disappeared into the same darkness that consumed everyone else, is a mystery that Central Yharnam keeps, but does not resolve. The hunters who came before are the predecessors without whose accumulated cost the player's progress would not be possible. The supplies they cached, the barriers they built, the notes they left in blood, the paths they partially cleared, and the shortcuts they discovered, all of these constitute a legacy that the player inherits without knowing its authors. Central Yharnam is as navigable as it is, which is to say barely navigable and at enormous cost, partly because of everything that was done in it by people who did not survive to benefit from what they accomplished. The district is a monument to the cost of prior hunter activity, written in the blood they spilled and the supplies they left and the positions they held until they could not hold them anymore. Chapter 11. What the Crows Know. The crows of Central Yharnam have been mentioned in passing throughout this video, but they deserve their own sustained attention because they are, in a specific sense, the district's only true survivors. Unlike the beasts, the crows have not transformed. Unlike the residents, they have not been destroyed. They were present before the hunt began, they are present during it, and in whatever future Central Yharnam has, they will remain. They are the only consistent witnesses to everything that happened here, and the question of what they know and what their presence tells us about the district is worth pursuing with the same attention we have given to the buildings and the blood. Crows are intelligent animals. This is established science, not folk wisdom. They demonstrate tool use, they maintain long-term memories of specific individuals, they communicate complex information to each other, and they appear to engage in behaviours consistent with something that might be called play or social learning. A crow that has observed events in a specific location over time has actually observed them in a way that produces durable memory traces, and a crow population that has lived in Central Yharnam for an extended period has collective experience of the district that predates the hunt by whatever amount of time that population has been established there. The density of crows in Central Yharnam is, as noted earlier, evidence of the quantity of death in the district over an extended period. But crow density also tells you about habituation. Crows are cautious animals that avoid environments they perceive as threatening to themselves. The fact that the crows of Central Yharnam have stayed in such numbers, despite the presence of beasts that could certainly threaten a crow, suggests that the crows have evaluated the risk posed by Central Yharnam's current inhabitants and found it acceptable. They know something about the beasts that makes them confident they can coexist with them at the risk level they find acceptable. They have observed the beasts long enough to understand them, which means they have observed them from before the transformation began, through the transformation process, and into the aftermath. The crows of Central Yharnam watched it happen. The specific locations where crows concentrate in Central Yharnam are not random. Crows gather where there is food, which is to say where there are bodies or body parts or organic material of sufficient quantity to sustain a population. Tracking the density of crows through the district gives you a heat map of where death has been concentrated, and that heat map does not distribute uniformly. The highest crow concentrations are in the areas near the canal, near what appear to have been the church-affiliated facilities, and near the areas that sustain the most intense hunter activity. The crows are showing you where the most people died, and the distribution of that mortality tells a specific story about how Central Yharnam fell. The crows' response to the player is notable because it differs from their response to the beasts. The beasts do not generally disturb the crows except through direct physical contact. The player, moving through the district in a way that is observant and directed rather than territorial and patrol-bound, produces a different crow response. Some of the crows in Central Yharnam watch the player with the specific attentive quality that crows display when they are assessing a novel situation, deciding whether this new element in their environment represents a threat, a resource, or something that can be ignored. The crows are evaluating the player, and whatever evaluation they reach, they generally choose to watch rather than flee, which is a crow behavior associated with entities the crow has assessed as potentially interesting but not immediately threatening. The crows that attack the player in certain elevated sections of Central Yharnam are not standard crow behavior. Crows do not generally attack humans unless defending a nest or a food source. The attacking behavior of certain crows in the district suggests either that these are not purely natural crows, or that something about those specific locations makes the crows significantly more aggressive than they would normally be. The elevated sections where crow attacks occur are also the sections with some of the most unusual architectural features and the most concentrated evidence of unusual activity. The crows are aggressive there because something about those spaces has made them aggressive, and that something is probably the same thing that made those spaces unusual in the first place. The items that some enemy crows drop in Central Yharnam are items that they could only have acquired by scavenging the bodies of individuals who carried those items. Crows do not spontaneously generate items. They acquire them through their normal scavenging behavior, picking up objects that interest them and carrying them back to cache locations. The items that crows drop tell you about the individuals whose bodies those crows scavenged. A crow carrying hunter equipment was at a hunter's body. A crow carrying unusual trinkets or medical supplies was at a body belonging to someone who carried those things. The crows of Central Yharnam are walking inventories of the dead, carrying in their cache behavior the residue of everyone who died here. The intelligence of crows also extends to their relationship with sound, and the sounds of Central Yharnam have a particular resonance for animals whose acoustic memory is as sharp as a crow's. The crows that were present when the screaming started, when the first sounds of transformation and violence filled the streets of the district, recorded those sounds in the way that crows record threatening stimuli, associating specific acoustic signatures with specific outcomes. The crows of Central Yharnam now live in an environment whose soundscape is defined by the sounds that their ancestral population, if crows can be said to have such a thing in the relevant sense, associated with the crisis events they witnessed. The ambient audio of the district is the sound of something the crows learn to be wary of, and the crows remain wary, watching, cataloguing, surviving. The philosophical status of the crows as witnesses to Central Yharnam's history is limited by the obvious impossibility of accessing what they know. But their presence serves a narrative function that goes beyond philosophy. They are the evidence that the district was a real place before it was a disaster, because they were here before the disaster and they are still here now. They predate the hunt. They will post-date whatever comes after. They are the continuity of Central Yharnam, the living thread connecting what it was to what it is to whatever it will eventually become. The crows are not tragic figures in the way that the beasts are tragic. They are simply persistent, in the way that all of nature is persistent, indifferent to the human dramas that take place beneath their perches, accumulating their own experience of the district in a register that humans cannot access and cannot fully comprehend. What the crows know about Central Yharnam is everything that happened there, stored in a form that cannot be read, carried in the bodies of creatures that will outlast every other witness to the district's history. It is perhaps the most complete archive of Central Yharnam's truth, and it is entirely inaccessible to the only beings who would know what to do with it. Chapter 12. The Geometry of Despair. There is a specific spatial experience that Central Yharnam produces in anyone who moves through it carefully, and that experience is not simply the experience of danger or of horror. It is the experience of a space that has been organised to deny exit. The district's geography, at multiple scales, creates a geometry of despair in which every path that appears to lead outward eventually curves back toward the centre. Every shortcut that seems to offer escape reveals itself as a connection to a deeper section of the same problem, and the only true. Exits from the district are either the entrance you came from or the boss encounter that functions as a ritual gate. The initial descent into Central Yharnam is a one-way transition at the moment of crossing. You drop through the grate, you land in the district, and the way back up is not immediately obvious. This is first an experience of physical entrapment, the specific anxiety produced by being in a space with a clear top but no clear ladder back to it. The game eventually provides a ladder, but the provision of that ladder comes after you have had enough time in the district to understand that the return route was not guaranteed. Central Yharnam begins by demonstrating that it has swallowed you and that you will need to earn your way back out. The street-level experience of Central Yharnam reinforces this geometry through the use of dead ends and apparent shortcuts that loop back to previously visited areas. Every street in Central Yharnam that you explore thoroughly eventually reveals either that it terminates in a barricade, a drop that cannot be reversed, a door that cannot be opened from the outside, or a connection to a section you have already passed through. The district has almost no through routes. It is an environment of circuits, each one eventually returning you to a location you have been before, each one accumulating the evidence of what the district is until you have enough understanding to face what is at its centre. The verticality of Central Yharnam adds another dimension to this geometry. The district exists on multiple vertical levels, from the elevated rooftops to the street level to the sewer sections to the canal below, and movement between these levels is controlled in ways that create a spatial hierarchy as much as a mechanical one. You can drop from the rooftops to the streets, but you cannot jump from the streets back to the rooftops. You can descend to the sewers through specific access points, but the sewers do not connect back to the streets at every point you might want. The district funnels downward, and moving downward in Central Yharnam means moving toward greater danger and greater revelation simultaneously. The management of the player's knowledge state through spatial restriction is one of Central Yharnam's most sophisticated design achievements. The district is built so that you can see more of it than you can reach at any given moment. From elevated positions, you can see streets you cannot get to yet. Through locked gates, you can see rooms you cannot enter. The visual access exceeds the physical access, which means you are always aware of how much of the district exists beyond what you have experienced, and that awareness produces a specific kind of spatial anxiety, the anxiety of knowing that the space you are navigating is larger and more complex than your current map of it. The shortcuts in Central Yharnam are a crucial element of this geometry because they transform the district's spatial experience from a linear progression into a network. Before you find the first shortcut, Central Yharnam is a one-way journey through an unfamiliar environment. After you find the first shortcut, it becomes a place you know, with specific relationships between its parts that you can use to navigate more efficiently. The shortcuts are not simply mechanical conveniences. They are the spatial education of the district, the means by which a maze becomes a map. The specific shortcuts available in Central Yharnam, when examined as a set, reveal that the district was designed to open in a specific sequence. You find some shortcuts early, before you fully understand what they connect. You find others only after you have already navigated the long way around enough times to understand what the shortcut saves. The temporal distribution of shortcut discovery corresponds roughly to the player's growing understanding of the district's structure, which means the shortcuts do not simply make navigation easier. They confirm and organize the player's accumulated spatial knowledge. The elevation of the cleric beast encounter relative to the rest of Central Yharnam is worth examining in spatial terms. The encounter takes place in a space that is both elevated above the main district and connected to it by a specific approach path that the player has been funneled toward by the district's geography. Everything in Central Yharnam's spatial organization points toward this encounter. The shortcuts create efficient paths to the approaches to the encounter. The main boulevard leads toward it. The elevated rooftops provide views of it before the player can reach it. Central Yharnam is spatially a machine for generating the cleric beast encounter, and the encounter itself is positioned so that surviving it and the spatial transformation it enables, the opening of the path forward, is experienced as a true exit from a geometry that had been organized around, containing you. The despair that Central Yharnam's geometry produces is not simply navigational frustration. It is the spatial equivalent of the emotional experience of someone who understands that the situation they are in does not have a simple external solution. The locked doors, the dead ends, the circular routes, the controlled shortcuts all communicate the same spatial message. There is no exit that does not require confronting what is at the centre. This is the geometry of a problem that cannot be circumnavigated, only faced. Central Yharnam's spatial design is not arbitrary difficulty. It is a formal statement about the nature of the challenge the game is presenting, embedded in the architecture of the district so thoroughly that you feel it in your legs before you understand it in your mind. Chapter 13. After the Ash. Central Yharnam will never recover. This is not a statement about the game world's future, which the game does not definitively describe. It is a statement about what recovery would require and what the district cannot provide. Recovery from the kind of catastrophe that Central Yharnam experienced requires the return of something that was lost, whether that is a population, a social structure, an economic base, or simply the accumulated lived experience that transforms a collection of buildings into a place where people feel they belong. Central Yharnam lost all of these things in a single night, and the nature of how it lost them ensures that they cannot be replaced. The physical infrastructure of Central Yharnam survived better than its social infrastructure. The buildings are damaged, but largely standing. The canal system still flows. The streets are disrupted, but not obliterated. The physical fabric of the district is the kind of thing that, with sufficient labour and intention, could be repaired. But the labour that would do the repair and the intention that would direct it were both lost with the people who lived here. The physical infrastructure of Central Yharnam survives as a monument to social infrastructure that no longer exists to use it. The contamination of Central Yharnam's environment by the old blood in the water supply, by whatever properties the blood river carries through the district, by the presence of large populations of transformed individuals who are themselves repositories of old blood exposure, means that physical reconstruction of the district would require either a remediation of the environmental contamination or an acceptance that future inhabitants would be exposed to the same conditions that produced the current catastrophe. Neither option seems realistic within the game's world, which means Central Yharnam is not simply temporarily abandoned, it is permanently uninhabitable, in the same way that certain places in the real world remain uninhabitable long after the events that made them so. The beasts of Central Yharnam are themselves a form of the district's persistence. They are not simply obstacles or dangers, they are the former residents, continuing to inhabit the spaces they always inhabited, maintaining the territorial relationships they had when they were human, performing the residual behaviours of their former lives in distorted form. Central Yharnam is still occupied, just not by anyone who can maintain it or remember why it matters. The district is inhabited by the absence of the people it was built for, presence in the shapes of absence, movement in the patterns of stillness, life in the form of something that is no longer exactly alive. The ash that settles over certain parts of Central Yharnam from the fires that have burned through the night is the district writing its own epitaph in the most literal possible terms. Ash is what remains after something has been consumed by fire, the mineral residue of organic material that was once living, the trace of something that existed and was destroyed. The ash of Central Yharnam is the remains of the things that burned in its fires, some of which were possessions and structures, and some of which were not. That ash settles on everything, on the cobblestones and the locked doors and the blood river and the barricades, coating the district in a layer of what it consumed itself with. Central Yharnam is burning its own history and breathing the smoke. The question of what will be left in Central Yharnam when the fires finally go out, when the last beasts have either been killed or have wandered away or have succumbed to whatever process eventually completes the transformation, is a question the game does not answer because the game takes place in the middle of the night, before the question becomes relevant. But the physical evidence of the district suggests that what will remain is a space emptied of the purpose that organised it, and filled instead with the evidence of what it had been. The buildings will stand, the canal will flow, the ash will settle, and the space will be the shape of a community that no longer exists. Too specific in its design to serve any purpose other than the one it was built for, and that purpose now impossible to fulfill. After the ash, Central Yharnam will be a monument. Not the kind of monument that was intended, not the testament to the church's healing work and the community's gratitude that the district's pre-hunt function represented. The monument it will be is the kind that nobody builds deliberately. The monument of evidence, of the trace that catastrophic events leave in spaces when they have burned through everything that could be consumed and left the rest standing in the silence. Central Yharnam will be, after the ash, the most detailed record available of what the healing church did with the trust of a community, and what that trust purchased for the community in return. The moral weight of Central Yharnam does not dissipate after the fires go out. It accumulates. Every day the district stands empty is another day of evidence for whatever judgment might eventually be applied to the church and to the practices that produced this outcome. The district is not simply a casualty of the hunt. It is an indictment, and it will remain an indictment as long as anything about it remains standing. The locked doors and the blood river and the crows and the ash are not just the aftermath of a tragedy. They are the documentary record of a crime, written in the most durable materials available and left in the open air for anyone who cares to read it. Chapter 14. Why Central Yharnam Keeps Calling You Back. This is the final chapter, and it is the one that is most directly about why the video you have just watched, and the game at its centre, continues to matter to the people who play it. Central Yharnam is a tutorial zone. Most players spend less than an hour in it on their first playthrough before they move on to more complex and more spectacular environments. And yet it keeps calling them back. Experienced players return to it. Discussions about it appear in communities years after the game's release. Videos like this one exist because there is enough in this one section of this one game to sustain hours of careful attention. The question of why that is the case is worth asking seriously. The first reason is density. Central Yharnam has more meaningful detail per square metre of game space than almost any comparable area in games of this type. Every element of the district is doing multiple things simultaneously. The architecture is telling a story while also creating gameplay challenges, while also establishing an aesthetic, while also embedding lore. The enemies are navigational obstacles while also being character studies, while also being evidence of specific historical events, while also embodying thematic arguments. The spatial geography is both a navigational puzzle and an emotional argument. This density means that spending more time in Central Yharnam always produces more understanding, because there is always more to understand, and that productive relationship with sustained attention is rare enough in games that when you find it, it stays with you. The second reason is grief. Central Yharnam is an elegy for a place that once held people's lives. An elegy is one of the oldest and most durable human impulses. The benches where people sat in the evenings, the fountains that are dry, the locked doors that someone locked in fear and hope. The district is full of the specific gravity of things that used to matter to people who no longer exist. And that gravity is not a game design element. It is a human emotion that game designers managed to produce through the careful accumulation of specific grounded details. When you feel something in Central Yharnam, you are feeling something real. The weight of human loss translated through the medium of an interactive environment. And that realness is what brings people back. The third reason is the question it poses that it does not answer. Central Yharnam raises more questions than any amount of analysis can fully resolve. The answers it does provide generate new questions. The questions it generates about the nature of trust and authority, and what communities give to institutions and what institutions owe to communities are not questions that resolve cleanly. Because they are not questions that resolve cleanly in the real world either. Central Yharnam keeps calling you back because it is sitting with questions that sit with you, and returning to it feels like returning to a conversation that is still going, with an interlocutor who is still, through the medium of locked doors and blood rivers and the empty benches of a destroyed neighbourhood, making its argument. The fourth reason is beauty. Central Yharnam is a beautiful place, in the specific way that devastated places can be beautiful, with the beauty of form that has survived the destruction of function, with the aesthetic richness of a world that was built with real care and then destroyed. The cobblestones and the ironwork and the carved stone and the lamplight and the ash and the blood and the crows against the dark sky are beautiful in a way that makes the tragedy of what happened here more acute rather than less. Beautiful things that are also broken make you feel the breakage more completely than broken things that were never beautiful. Central Yharnam was beautiful before it was broken, and it is beautiful still, in the way that ruins are beautiful, and that beauty is part of why it stays with you. The fifth reason is the player's own transformation within it. You arrive in Central Yharnam unable to handle it. You leave it having handled it. The district is designed to be exactly hard enough that surviving it produces a specific experience of capability developing under pressure, of understanding accumulating through failure and repetition until the environment that was once mysterious and deadly becomes not safe, but legible. The player who exits Central Yharnam after defeating the cleric beast is not the same player who descended through the grate. The district has changed them in the small but real way that demanding experiences change people, and that personal transformation is associated with the place that produced it, which is why returning to Central Yharnam always carries the resonance of a place where something happened to you. Specifically, Central Yharnam is a tutorial, yes, but it is a tutorial that teaches you something that the rest of the game will require you to have, but that very few games bother to teach. How to read a world that is not going to explain itself to you. How to find meaning in the specific and the concrete. How to understand catastrophe not as spectacle, but as the end point of countless specific human decisions made by specific human people in specific circumstances. And how to sit with tragedy without resolution and find that sitting with it is not defeat, but a form of respect for what was lost. Central Yharnam is the beginning of a lesson that Bloodborne teaches across its entire running time, and the reason it keeps calling you back is that the lesson is not one you finish learning. You just keep learning it more completely, every time you drop through the grate and land in the street below and hear the crows on the rooftops and the distant screaming and see the fires in the dark, and start again.